There is a moment, buried somewhere in the ancient memory of our species, when a human being first stood before others and spoke, not to warn of danger, not to beg for food, but to persuade, to change what another person believed, to move them. That moment, whenever it occurred and wherever it happened, was more consequential than the invention of the wheel, more transformative than the discovery of fire. Because the wheel moves objects, fire warms bodies, but words move people, and people, when moved in the right direction at the right moment, move everything else. We live in an age that has grown suspicious of eloquence. We are taught, rightly, to distrust politicians who speak too smoothly, salesmen who charm too easily, demagogues who inflame too effectively. We have seen what words weaponized by hatred can do. The speeches that filled stadiums and emptied cities, the broadcasts that turned neighbors into executioners, the manifestos that sent armies marching toward catastrophe. And so we have developed a kind of cultural antibody against the power of the spoken word, a reflex that treats persuasiveness itself as a form of manipulation. But this suspicion, however understandable, has caused us to forget something essential. The same force that can burn a civilization down can also build one up. Think of what words have actually accomplished. A young Indian lawyer, trained in London, stood on dusty platforms across a subcontinent and spoke until an empire bowed and walked away. A Baptist minister from Atlanta, armed with nothing but a microphone and an extraordinary mind, cracked open the conscience of a nation that had convinced itself it had no conscience left to crack. A half-blind Athenian who wandered the markets asking inconvenient questions rewired the entire operating system of Western thought, not with armies, not with wealth, but with the disciplined, relentless, infuriating deployment of the right question at the right time. These were not accidents. These were not merely charismatic personalities who happened to stumble into history. These were craftsmen, people who understood, at a profound level, how language works on the human mind, and who used that understanding with intention and with genius. This book is about that craft. It is about the techniques, the strategies, the psychological principles and rhetorical devices that the greatest speakers in history used to change the minds of individuals and the directions of civilizations. It is about what Churchill knew that most politicians don't, what Lincoln understood about an audience that his rivals couldn't grasp, what Elizabeth I did with her voice and her body and her words in a field at Tilbury that turned a frightened army into something ferocious. It is about the structure of a sentence that lodges itself in the memory for centuries, the rhythm of a speech that makes the blood move faster, the single perfectly chosen image that collapses a complex argument into something a crowd can feel in its chest rather than merely understand in its head. But this book is also something more than a catalog of historical speeches. It is an attempt to answer a question that should matter to every person alive. Why do words work? What is happening in the human brain when a particular arrangement of sounds produces tears, or fury, or sudden courage, or the willingness to die for an idea? Why does one speaker leave an audience cold while another leaves them transformed? Why do some phrases survive for 2,000 years while others dissolve before the applause is finished? The answers to these questions are not mystical. They are not the exclusive property of some rare and gifted few. They are, in fact, learnable. They are patterns, and once you can see the patterns, you cannot unsee them. We will travel across centuries and continents in the pages that follow. We will sit in the Roman Senate with Cicero as he dismantles a conspiracy with nothing but syntax. We will stand in the rain at Gettysburg with Lincoln as he performs an act of rhetorical alchemy, transforming a battlefield dedication into a redefinition of the American Republic itself. We will feel the electricity of a Harlem ballroom when Malcolm X addresses a crowd with a precision and an urgency that made even his opponents lean forward in their seats. We will examine the cold, calculated mechanics of propaganda alongside the hot, sincere fire of genuine moral conviction. And we will learn to understand the difference, because the difference matters enormously, both for those who would speak and for those who would listen. What you will find, I think, is surprising. The greatest speakers were rarely the most naturally gifted. Many of them were terrified of public speaking. Many of them failed catastrophically before they succeeded magnificently. Churchill had a speech impediment. Demosthenes, by legend, was nearly incomprehensible before he spent years training his voice on the seashore. Lincoln was considered an awkward, ungainly backwoods lawyer by people who later wept at his words. What separated these figures from the merely adequate was not talent in the conventional sense. It was understanding, an almost scientific grasp of how persuasion works, combined with the discipline to apply that understanding under pressure, in front of hostile or indifferent or desperate crowds, at moments when the stakes could not have been higher. These are the moments this book lives inside. Not the comfortable speeches, not the prepared remarks at friendly gatherings, but the speeches delivered at the edge of catastrophe, when a nation was fracturing, when a cause seemed lost, when fear had replaced reason, and only words stood between a people and their worst impulses. It is in those moments that the craft of speaking reveals itself most clearly, because it is in those moments that the craft is most desperately needed. And it is in studying those moments, really studying them, not just admiring them, that we begin to understand what language is actually for. The pen, the old saying goes, is mightier than the sword. But a pen lying on a desk is nothing. It is the hand that holds it, the mind that drives it, and above all, the voice that carries its words into a room full of human beings with beating hearts and changing minds. That is where the real power lives. That is what this book is about. And by the time you reach the final page, you will hear every speech you ever encountered differently. You will hear the architecture beneath the words, the strategy beneath the passion, the ancient and still living craft of the people who bent history. Not with armies, not with money, not with laws, but with the precise and deliberate and sometimes magnificent power of what they said and how they said it. Before we can understand what made the great speakers great, we need to understand the territory they were working in. That territory is the human mind, not the rational, deliberate, careful mind we like to imagine we possess, but the actual mind, the one that makes decisions before it knows it has made them, the one that responds to rhythm and image and story in ways that bypass conscious analysis entirely. The great speakers understood this territory not because they had read neuroscience. Most of them lived centuries before neuroscience existed, but because they had observed human beings with extraordinary care, and what they observed taught them something that modern psychology has since confirmed in laboratory after laboratory. People do not primarily decide with logic. They decide with feeling, and then they use logic to explain to themselves what they have already decided. This is not a cynical observation. It is simply an accurate one. And understanding it is the first and most important step toward understanding why certain speeches changed history and others, equally sincere and equally full of facts, left no trace whatsoever. Facts on their own are almost entirely powerless. This is a difficult thing to accept, particularly for educated people who have been trained to believe that evidence and argument are the highest forms of communication. But the historical record is unambiguous on this point. You can present a crowd with the most airtight, logical case in the world, and they will nod politely and go home and do exactly what they were going to do before you open your mouth. Or you can tell them a story, give them an image, make them feel something in their bodies, and they will walk through fire for you. The great speakers knew this. They built their speeches accordingly. The person who first wrote this down with any systematic rigor was a compact, methodical Athenian named Aristotle, who produced, sometime around 350 BC, a slim and ferociously intelligent text called the Rhetoric. It is not an exciting read. It is dry, technical, and occasionally repetitive in the way that lecture notes tend to be, which is essentially what it was. But buried inside its careful prose is a framework that every great speaker in the Western tradition has either consciously applied or independently rediscovered, because it maps, with remarkable precision, exactly how persuasion actually works. Aristotle proposed that all effective speaking rests on three foundations, which he called ethos, pathos, and logos, roughly translated as character, emotion, and reason. And he was careful to note that most people assume logos, rational argument, is the most important of the three. He was equally careful to note that they are wrong. Ethos comes first in Aristotle's account, and it comes first because it has to. Before an audience will listen to what you say, they must decide whether to trust who you are. This decision happens in seconds, sometimes in fractions of seconds, and it happens largely beneath conscious awareness. It is based on 1,000 tiny signals. The way a speaker stands, the confidence or hesitance in their voice, whether they seem to know the room they're standing in, whether their words match their manner, whether there is coherence between the person and the message. When this trust exists, audiences will follow a speaker through enormously complex and difficult arguments. When it doesn't exist, they will reject even the simplest and most obviously true statements. Ethos is not the same as reputation, though reputation contributes to it. It is something projected in the moment, something performed, and performance here does not mean fakery. It means the deliberate, skillful communication of genuine authority. Abraham Lincoln understood ethos in a way that was almost instinctive. When he stood up to debate Stephen Douglas in 1858, he faced a man who was better dressed, more polished, more conventionally impressive in every superficial way. Douglas had a booming baritone, a commanding physical presence, the confident ease of a man accustomed to winning rooms. Lincoln was tall and angular and awkward, his voice higher than people expected, his clothes never quite fitting right. And yet, within minutes of Lincoln beginning to speak, audiences shifted. They leaned in. Because Lincoln had developed, through years of practice in frontier courtrooms and rural political meetings, an ethos that was more powerful than any polish, the ethos of radical honesty. He spoke as if he were thinking out loud, as if he were genuinely working through the problem with the audience rather than delivering conclusions he had already reached. He would openly acknowledge the strongest version of his opponent's argument before dismantling it. He would concede points he couldn't defend rather than bluffing through them. This transparency built a trust that Douglas's slicker performances could never match. And it was this trust, this ethos, that made people willing to go wherever Lincoln's logic led them. Pathos is the second pillar, and it is arguably the most powerful. Aristotle defined it as the emotional state of the audience, and he argued that the speaker's primary job is to put the audience in the right emotional state to receive the message, to make them feel what they need to feel in order to truly understand what they need to understand. This sounds manipulative, and it can be, but it can also be something far more profound. The recognition that human beings only truly grasp things they have felt, that an abstraction understood only intellectually is barely understood at all. When Frederick Douglass stood before audiences in the 1840s and described, in precise and devastating detail, what it felt like to be enslaved, the specific sounds, the specific smells, the weight of specific humiliations, he was not merely informing his listeners. He was transferring an experience. He was taking something that existed inside his own body and, through the alchemy of language, installing it inside theirs. And once it was there, once they had felt even a fraction of what he had felt, the abstract moral argument against slavery became something visceral and undeniable. You cannot unfeel a thing. That is the power of pathos deployed with precision and honesty. But pathos without logos collapses into mere sentiment, and logos, the third pillar, is what gives a speech its spine. Logos is not simply facts. It is the architecture of the argument, the sequence in which ideas are presented, the way evidence is selected and arranged, the logical path along which the speaker leads the audience from where they are to where the speaker wants them to be. The great speakers were masters of this architecture in ways their contemporaries often weren't, and the difference was not intelligence. It was structure. Cicero, whose speeches we will spend considerable time with in a later chapter, approached the construction of an argument the way an engineer approaches the construction of a bridge. Every element load-bearing, every transition calculated, nothing ornamental that didn't also serve structural function. When he rose to accuse Verres of corruption, or to expose Catalan's conspiracy, he didn't simply list wrongdoings. He sequenced them, building from the merely shocking to the truly monstrous, letting the audience's outrage accumulate like water behind a dam until the moment of release, when the emotional flood and the logical conclusion arrived simultaneously and became inseparable. That simultaneity, when you feel something and understand something at exactly the same moment, is the signature of great rhetoric. It is what makes a speech not just persuasive, but unforgettable. There is a fourth element that Aristotle didn't fully systematize, but that every great speaker has understood: the power of specificity. Vague language produces vague feelings and vague thoughts. Specific language, the precise detail, the exact name, the particular image, cuts through the noise of the mind like nothing else. When Winston Churchill, in June of 1940, told the British people that they would fight on the beaches and the landing grounds and the fields and the streets and the hills, he was not being redundant. He was being specific, building a physical, geographical, sensory reality out of words, placing his listeners in an actual landscape where the fight was actually going to happen, making the abstraction of national resistance into something they could see and touch and stand inside of. When Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed, in August of 1963, he did not dream in generalities. He dreamed of specific places: Mississippi, Alabama, every mountain and molehill of Georgia, and specific people, including his own 4 children, and a specific table of brotherhood where previously estranged strangers would sit down together. The dream was universal in its aspiration, but utterly particular in its imagery. And it was the particularity that made it lodge so deeply in the memory of everyone who heard it. Alongside specificity sits the almost magical power of repetition. We are taught, in school, that repetition is a weakness in writing, a sign that the author has run out of ideas or doesn't trust the reader. In speech, this is completely inverted. Repetition, deployed skillfully, is one of the most potent tools a speaker possesses. It creates rhythm, and rhythm, as any musician can tell you, produces a physical response in the body, a slight entrainment, a kind of synchronization between the speaker and the audience that bypasses critical analysis and works directly on the nervous system. When King repeated, "I have a dream," or "let freedom ring," he wasn't being lazy or redundant. He was doing something deeply sophisticated, using the repetition to build a cumulative emotional pressure that increased with each recurrence, so that by the end, when the final instance arrived, the phrase carried the weight of everything that had come before it. The audience didn't just hear a sentence. They felt the whole architecture of everything the sentence had come to mean. This technique, which the ancient Greeks called anaphora, the repetition of a word or phrase at the beginning of successive clauses, appears in great speeches across virtually every culture and every era, which tells us something important. It works because of something fundamental in the human brain, not because of something specific to any one tradition. There is also the matter of what speakers choose not to say. The architecture of a great speech includes its silences, its omissions, its strategic restraints, and this dimension of the craft is perhaps the least understood and the least discussed. When Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address in November of 1863, He spoke for roughly 2 minutes. The man who preceded him, Edward Everett, one of the most celebrated orators of the age, spoke for 2 hours. Everett's speech was learned, detailed, carefully researched, and almost entirely forgotten before the week was out. Lincoln's was about 270 words, and it has never stopped echoing. The difference was not simply concision for its own sake. It was that Lincoln had made a choice, a ruthless, surgical choice, about what needed to be said and what didn't, about what the moment required and what it could do without. Every word in the Gettysburg Address is doing essential work. There is no fat, no padding, no throat clearing, no performance of effort. It reads like something that was always there, waiting to be found, not something constructed. That quality, the appearance of inevitability, is itself a technique, one that takes enormous effort to achieve and is designed to conceal the effort entirely. What all of these elements share, ethos, pathos, logos, specificity, repetition, strategic omission, is that they are all, at root, acts of attention. The great speakers were, before anything else, extraordinary observers of human beings. They watched how people responded to different kinds of language. They noticed what made a crowd lean forward versus lean back. They paid attention to the moment, to the specific fears and hopes and frustrations of the specific people they were addressing at the specific point in history when they were addressing them, and they calibrated their words accordingly. This is why the greatest speeches cannot be simply transplanted across time and context and expected to work. Churchill's finest hour speech works because it addresses, with uncanny precision, exactly what the British people were feeling in the summer of 1940. The combination of fear, pride, defiance, and exhaustion that characterized that particular moment. Transplant it to a different crisis, and it becomes something different because the emotional landscape has changed. The speech was, in the deepest sense, an act of listening before it was an act of speaking. This is the paradox at the heart of great oratory, and it is the paradox that this book will return to again and again. The speakers who changed history were not the ones who said the loudest or most forceful things. They were the ones who listened most carefully, who understood most deeply what their audience needed to hear, and who then found, through craft and discipline and sometimes genuine inspiration, the exact words, in the exact order, with the exact rhythm and specificity and emotional charge that would allow a room full of ordinary human beings to suddenly feel that something important was true, something difficult was possible, something they had only dimly sensed was now blazingly clear. That is not magic. That is architecture. And like all architecture, it can be studied, understood, and learned. The chapters that follow are an attempt to do exactly that. One extraordinary voice at a time, one pivotal moment at a time, one carefully constructed sentence at a time. We begin, as so much of Western thought begins, in Athens. Athens in the 5th century BCE was a city obsessed with talk. Not casual talk, not gossip or idle conversation, but the formal, structured, high-stakes talk of the assembly, the law courts, and the philosophical schools. The kind of talk where your ability to speak well was the difference between winning and losing, between freedom and slavery, between life and death. In no other civilization before or since was the spoken word so explicitly, so consciously, so institutionally powerful. The Athenian democracy didn't run on backroom deals or inherited authority. It ran on persuasion. Every citizen could speak in the assembly. Every citizen could be prosecuted or defended in the courts. And in a world without professional lawyers or trained politicians in the modern sense, the man who could speak best won. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary civilization to develop if you happen to be studying how language changes the course of events. Because in Athens, language was the course of events. It was in this environment that a young man named Demosthenes decided, with a ferocity that bordered on mania, to become the greatest speaker in the world. The story of how he did it is one of the most compelling self-improvement narratives in all of history, and it matters not because of its inspirational quality, though it has plenty of that, but because of what it tells us about the nature of rhetorical skill. Demosthenes was not born great. By most accounts, he was born the opposite. He had a weak voice, an indistinct articulation, a habit of twitching his shoulder when he spoke, and a nervous energy that made him seem anxious and unconvincing in front of crowds. His first appearance before the Athenian assembly was a disaster. He was heckled off the platform. He went home, by all accounts, in despair. And then he did something that separates the people who change history from the people who merely witness it. He decided that his limitations were problems to be solved, not facts to be accepted. What followed was a training regimen of almost frightening intensity. He built an underground study where he would work for months at a time, shaving half his head so that vanity wouldn't tempt him to go out in public before he was ready. He practiced speaking with small stones in his mouth to force clarity of articulation. He recited speeches while running uphill to develop the breath control necessary for sustained delivery. He memorized and rememorized entire works of Thucydides to absorb the rhythms of complex Greek prose into his muscles and his instincts. He went to the seashore and practiced projecting his voice over the sound of the waves, training himself to fill a space with sound the way a great actor fills a theater. These stories may contain some legendary embellishment. They come down to us through sources writing centuries after the fact, but their core message is confirmed by everything we know about how rhetorical skill actually develops. It is not given. It is built, and it is built through a kind of obsessive, systematic, relentless practice that most people find they are not willing to do. The results were extraordinary. The mature Demosthenes became something Athens had rarely seen. A speaker capable of combining the intellectual rigor of a philosopher with the emotional intensity of a poet and the tactical cunning of a general. His greatest speeches, known as the Philippics, were delivered over roughly a decade beginning around 351 BCE, and they were aimed at a single, urgent, terrifying purpose: to wake Athens up to the threat posed by Philip II of Macedon, the brilliant and ruthless king who was methodically conquering the Greek world city by city, while Athens sat comfortable and complacent, telling itself that the threat wasn't real, or wasn't that serious, or would somehow resolve itself without requiring sacrifice. The Philippics are, in this sense, the first great political speeches in recorded history. Not ceremonial speeches, not philosophical discourses, but urgent, tactical interventions designed to change specific policies at specific moments of crisis. They failed, ultimately, in their immediate political goal. Philip did conquer Greece, and his son Alexander went on to remake the world. But they succeeded as rhetoric so completely that Philippic entered the English language as the word for any fierce, denunciatory speech, and they were studied, imitated, and annotated for 2,000 years by everyone who wanted to understand how language can be used as a weapon. What made the Philippics so powerful? Several things, but the most important was Demosthenes' understanding of what we might now call the rhetoric of urgency. He understood that one of the most difficult tasks a speaker faces is not persuading an audience that something is true, but persuading them that it matters now, that the moment for comfortable deliberation has passed and the moment for decision has arrived. Humans are constitutionally inclined toward inaction. We prefer to wait and see. We are expert at finding reasons why a crisis is less serious than it appears, why the moment for response can be safely deferred, why the people warning us are probably being alarmist. Demosthenes battled this tendency with a combination of techniques that together create what might be called a siege on complacency. He used sharp, punchy sentences when he needed urgency, and longer, building sentences when he needed to make the weight of evidence feel overwhelming. He constantly contrasted the greatness of Athens' past with the smallness of its present behavior, exploiting the gap between what his audience believed about themselves and what they were actually doing, because nothing motivates like shame when it is applied with precision. And he returned, obsessively, to the clock. Time was running out. Every season of inaction was a season Philip used. Every comfortable delay was a gift to the enemy. The structure of urgency, the ticking clock embedded in the argument, is a technique that every great political speaker since has used, consciously or not, because it works on something deep in human psychology, the fear of irreversible loss. 300 years after Demosthenes, in a Rome that had absorbed and transformed the Greek rhetorical tradition, Marcus Tullius Cicero took these techniques and elevated them to an art form so complete and so sophisticated that his speeches remain among the most studied documents in the history of human communication. Cicero was a novice homo, a new man, a social climber from a provincial family with no noble blood and no military glory to recommend him in a society that valued both enormously. He had, in the coin of the Roman Republic, almost nothing. What he had instead was his voice, his mind, and a furious understanding of how persuasion worked. He used these tools to become the most powerful man in Rome who had never commanded an army, and eventually to save the Republic. Or so he believed, and so a reasonable case can still be made, from a conspiracy that would have destroyed it 2 decades before it ultimately was destroyed by different means. Cicero's most famous speeches, the Catilinarian orations, were delivered in 63 BCE against Lucius Sergius Catilina, a bankrupt aristocrat who had organized a conspiracy to overthrow the Republic through assassination, arson, and insurrection. The conspiracy was real and extremely dangerous, and Cicero, who had been elected consul, the highest office in Rome, that year, had through his network of informants obtained detailed knowledge of it. The challenge he faced was not informational. He had the facts. The challenge was persuasion, convincing the Roman Senate, many of whose members were sympathetic to Catiline or at least uncertain about the scale of the threat, to authorize extraordinary measures against a Roman citizen without formal trial. This was legally and morally complex territory, and Cicero knew it. His solution was one of the most audacious rhetorical strategies in recorded history. He invited Catiline himself to attend the Senate meeting where the conspiracy would be exposed. The first Catilinarian oration, delivered with Catiline sitting in the chamber, begins with one of the most electrifying openings in all of rhetoric. Quousque tandem abutera, Catilina, patientia nostra? How long, Catiline, will you abuse our patience? The quousque tandem, how long, finally, is a masterpiece of compressed outrage. In 3 Latin words, Cicero establishes that he has been patient, that the patience has been abused, and that the time for patience is definitively over. The question form is crucial. It is not an accusation, which Catiline could answer with a counter-accusation. It is a question, which puts Catiline immediately on the defensive, forced to react rather than act. And the choice to address Catiline directly, to look him in the eye in the Senate chamber and speak about him as if he were already a convicted criminal, was a performance of absolute certainty, so confident and so public that any wavering senators in the room found the ground shifting beneath their comfortable uncertainty. Cicero was not merely informing. He was staging a scene, creating a theatrical reality in which Catiline's guilt was already established, and the only remaining question was what to do about it. What Cicero understood, and what makes his speeches so worth studying, is that a speech is never merely an argument. It is always also a performance, and the space in which it is delivered is always a theater with a specific emotional atmosphere that the speaker must read, use, and when necessary transform. When he delivered the second Catilinarian oration to the Roman people in the Forum, an entirely different audience from the Senate, he adjusted everything. His diction became simpler, his sentences shorter, his emotional register more direct. where the Senate speech was full of irony and legal complexity and the kind of knowing insinuation that sophisticated insiders could appreciate. The forum speech was visceral, clear, and designed to produce in ordinary Romans the specific emotion Cicero needed them to feel. Not outrage, which might have been ungovernable, but a calm, determined, righteous sense that the Republic was being protected by capable and honest men, and that the people's role was to trust and support those men. Same crisis, same facts, same speaker, but an entirely different speech, because an entirely different audience required an entirely different emotional journey. This adaptability, this ability to read a room and rebuild the same argument for radically different people, is one of the marks of the truly great speaker, and Cicero practiced it with a precision that, when you study his surviving speeches, feels almost supernatural. He was also, it must be said, utterly ruthless in his rhetoric when the situation demanded it. The varying orations, delivered against the corrupt Governor Gaius Verres in 70 BCE, are a tutorial in how to destroy a reputation so completely that no defense is possible. Cicero had gathered an enormous quantity of evidence of Verres's corruption, extortion, theft of art, judicial murder, and the obvious strategy would have been to present it systematically, one charge building on another in a logical progression. Instead, Cicero opened the prosecution with a surprise. He announced that he would be brief. He would not give a long speech. He would let the evidence speak for itself. He then proceeded to present, in rapid and devastating succession, a series of specific, concrete, nauseating examples of Verres's crimes. Not a statistical overview of corruption, but individual stories, individual victims, individual moments of cruelty and greed told with the specificity of a novelist and the moral outrage of a prophet. The effect was overwhelming. Verres's defense attorney, the legendary orator Hortensius, found himself with nothing to say. Verres fled Rome before the verdict. Cicero had won not by overwhelming the audience with comprehensiveness, but by selecting, with perfect instinct, the stories most likely to produce the exact emotional response he needed, and then getting out of the way and letting the stories do their work. The legacy of the Greek and Roman rhetorical tradition is immense and strange. It produced, on one hand, some of the most important speeches in recorded history, speeches that genuinely shaped the political destiny of two of the greatest civilizations the world has known. It also produced, in its later and more decadent phases, an obsession with technique for its own sake. The empty virtuosity of the professional rhetorician who could argue any side of any question with equal facility and equal insincerity, producing a kind of beautiful, purposeless speechifying that Plato attacked with fury and that later generations rightly identified as a corruption of the form. This tension between rhetoric as genuine moral communication and rhetoric as mere performance never fully resolves itself, and we will encounter it again and again throughout this book. But what the greatest of the Greek and Roman speakers demonstrated, at their best, was that the tension need not be paralyzing. Cicero genuinely believed in the republic he was defending. Demosthenes genuinely believed in the Athens he was trying to save. Their craft was in the service of conviction, and it was precisely that combination, the technical mastery deployed in the service of something genuinely felt, that gave their words a power that has not entirely faded in 2,000 years. When we read the Quo Usque Tandem today, we still feel the edge in it. We still feel the impatience and the controlled fury and the absolute confidence of a man who knows he is right and will not be silent. The words are ancient. The force behind them is not. There is a category of speech that operates at a different altitude from all the others. A kind of speaking that does not merely aim to change a policy or win a legal case or inspire soldiers before a battle, but aims to change the fundamental story a human being tells about who they are, why they exist, and what they owe to the universe and to each other. This is religious oratory. and its power dwarfs almost everything else in the history of human communication. Not because it is more technically sophisticated than political speech, often it is less so. Not because its speakers were more talented than the great political orators, some were, some weren't, but because it addresses the deepest and most consequential questions a human being can face, and because when it works, when a speaker manages to reach someone at that level of depth, the transformation it produces is not a changed opinion or a changed vote, but a changed life. Changed lives, multiplied across populations and sustained across generations, are how civilizations get built, redirected, and sometimes destroyed. The speakers who understood this and who possessed the craft to exploit it reshaped the human world more thoroughly than any army or any government has ever managed to do. To understand why religious speech is so powerful, we need to understand something about the psychological structure of the human being who sits in the pew or stands in the crowd. Every person alive carries, somewhere beneath their ordinary daily consciousness, a set of questions they cannot answer and cannot stop asking. Who am I really? Does my life mean anything? Why do I suffer? What do I owe other people? What happens when I die? These are not questions that logic resolves. They are not questions that science, for all its magnificence, fully answers. They are the open wounds of consciousness, the places where the mind turns back on itself and finds no solid ground. A speaker who can address these questions with apparent confidence, with genuine warmth, with specific and vivid language that makes the abstract feel suddenly concrete and the terrifying feel suddenly manageable, has access to a depth of human attention that no political speech can touch. The political speaker asks for your vote. The religious speaker asks for your soul. The stakes are so much higher that the emotional response is correspondingly more intense, more durable, and more transformative. The earliest Christian missionaries understood this intuitively, but the figure who first systematized it into something approaching a conscious rhetorical method was a small, intense, physically unremarkable man from Tarsus named Paul, who had been trained in both Jewish scriptural argument and Greek rhetorical technique, and who used this unusual combination to carry a message from the eastern edge of the Roman Empire to its western edge within 3 decades of what he believed to be the most important event in human history. Paul's letters, which are, of course, speeches in written form, intended to be read aloud to assembled communities, are among the most rhetorically sophisticated documents in the ancient world, and what makes them particularly interesting for our purposes is that they reveal, with unusual transparency, the conscious decisions of a speaker trying to reach radically different audiences with the same essential message. When Paul writes to the Jewish community in Rome, he argues from Scripture, deploying the intricate interpretive techniques of rabbinical tradition that his Jewish readers would recognize and respect. When he addresses the philosophers of Athens on the Areopagus, as described in the Acts of the Apostles, he begins not with Scripture, but with their own poetry and their own intellectual traditions, as even some of your own poets have said, acknowledging their framework before inviting them to extend it. This is not opportunism or dishonesty. It is the most sophisticated form of audience awareness, the understanding that the same truth, delivered identically to every listener, reaches almost no one, while the same truth, translated into the specific language and assumptions of each particular audience, has a chance of reaching everyone. Paul's most extraordinary rhetorical achievement, though, is not a specific speech, but a specific technique that runs through almost all of his writing. The ability to make the local feel universal and the universal feel local simultaneously. When he writes, in his letter to the Galatians, that there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one. He is doing something that the ancient world had never quite managed to do before, asserting a universal human equality in terms so direct and so absolute that its implications were revolutionary in ways that took centuries to fully unfold. But he is doing it in a specific letter to a specific community about a specific disagreement over circumcision. The extraordinary specificity of the context doesn't diminish the universality of the principle. Paradoxically, it amplifies it, because the principle is being stated not as an abstract philosophical position, but as the answer to a real human problem affecting real human beings. This is the technique, grounding the transcendent in the specific, that every great religious speaker has used since, and it is worth pausing to note how counterintuitive it is. Our instinct is to think that universal truths should be stated in universal terms. The great religious speakers knew better. Universal truths are felt most deeply when they arrive wearing the face of the particular. Jump forward 12 centuries and move east, and you find a tradition of oratory developing around the person of the Prophet Muhammad that operates by entirely different mechanisms and yet achieves effects of comparable magnitude. Muhammad was, by all historical accounts, including those of his opponents, an extraordinarily compelling speaker, a man whose words, as remembered and recorded by his companions, carried a combination of poetic beauty, moral urgency, and what his followers experienced as divine authority that transformed a fractured, tribal, polytheistic peninsula into a unified civilization within a single generation. The Quran itself, which in Islamic tradition is understood as the direct word of God, and which Muhammad received and recited rather than composed, is, from a purely rhetorical standpoint, one of the most sonically powerful documents ever produced in any language. The Arabic of the Quran is structured around patterns of sound, rhythm, and repetition so intricate and so beautiful that it produced, and still produces in those who hear it recited correctly, a response that seems to bypass intellectual analysis and work directly on the body. The concept of ijaz, the inimitability of the Quran, the claim that no human being could produce anything comparable, was itself a rhetorical challenge, an act of deliberate provocation designed to make opponents attempt a comparison and fail, and the failure of those attempts was then used as evidence of divine origin. This is persuasion operating at a level of sophistication that takes the breath away. The form of the speech itself becomes part of the argument for the speech's truth. The lessons of religious oratory moved westward and forward in time to explode in the 16th century in one of the most consequential acts of rhetorical courage in European history. Martin Luther was not, by the standards of his great predecessors, an unusually gifted speaker in the classical sense. He was a university professor and an Augustinian friar, trained in scholastic theology and scripture, and his natural rhetorical instincts ran toward argument rather than ornamentation. But what Luther possessed in compensation for what he lacked in classical polish was something more valuable for his particular moment: an absolute, burning, completely unperformable conviction, and the ability to put that conviction into words that ordinary people, not scholars, not theologians, but farmers and tradespeople and merchants and servants, could understand, feel, and make their own. When he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg in 1517, the act itself was rhetorical before a single word was read. The physical gesture of posting a public challenge on a public door was a performance of defiance designed to be seen and interpreted to communicate through action what the words then specified in argument. But it was the words themselves, and particularly the words of the German Bible Luther subsequently translated and the German pamphlets he produced in extraordinary abundance, that actually changed history. Luther's genius was translation in the deepest sense, not merely converting Latin into German, but converting the entire register of religious communication from the elevated, abstract, institutionally mediated language of the church into the direct, specific, emotionally immediate language of ordinary German life. He famously said that you had to look at the mouths of ordinary people, the mother in the home, the children in the street, the man in the marketplace, to understand what German actually sounded like. And then you had to use that German, not the German of scholars. This sounds obvious. It was revolutionary. The church had maintained, consciously and as a matter of explicit policy, that the gap between theological truth and ordinary comprehension was real and necessary, that the difficulty of Scripture was not a flaw, but a feature, requiring the mediation of a trained clergy who could interpret and explain. Luther abolished this gap rhetorically before he, or anyone else, had fully worked out the theological implications. He handed the words directly to the people, in their own language, and trusted them to read. In doing so, he didn't just start a religious reformation. He started a revolution in how human beings thought about their relationship to authority, to institutions, and to the question of who gets to determine what is true. The printing press amplified his words across Europe at a speed no previous rhetorical movement had ever achieved. But it was the quality of the words themselves, their directness, their warmth, their combination of fierce theological argument and completely accessible human appeal that gave the printing press something worth spreading. The tradition of religious oratory that descended from this transformation produced, 2 centuries later in England and the American colonies, a phenomenon known as the Great Awakening, a wave of evangelical preaching that swept through populations with the force and speed of a contagion, and whose most extraordinary practitioner was a young Englishman named George Whitefield, who may have been the most purely gifted public speaker in the history of the English language. Whitefield could fill a field with 30,000 people and make every one of them feel that he was speaking directly to them. He rehearsed his sermons with theatrical obsession, practicing gestures and vocal modulations in front of mirrors, consulting the great actor David Guerre for advice on how to convey genuine emotion through calculated physical technique, a combination that scandalized his more straight-laced contemporaries and fascinated everyone who saw him perform. Benjamin Franklin, who was deeply skeptical of religious enthusiasm and who attended a Whitefield sermon specifically intending to resist the appeal, found himself, to his own astonishment, emptying his pockets into the collection plate. Franklin later analyzed what had happened to him with the clear-eyed curiosity of the scientist he was, and his conclusion was revealing. It wasn't the content of Whitefield's message that had moved him. It was the delivery, the voice, the pacing, the way Whitefield built emotional pressure and released it, the way he made each person in a crowd of thousands feel that the sermon was addressed specifically to them, personally, about the specific condition of their specific soul. Whitefield's technique of making the universal feel personal, of speaking in such a way that each individual listener felt simultaneously part of a vast communal experience and addressed in absolute privacy, is one of the most difficult achievements in all of public speaking, and Whitefield managed it through a specific set of devices that we can identify and analyze. He used direct address constantly, shifting between the second-person singular and the second-person plural in ways that created a rhythm of intimacy and communion. He used pauses, long, charged, almost theatrical pauses, that gave audiences space to feel what he just said rather than simply processing it cognitively. He used his voice as an instrument of extraordinary range, moving from barely audible murmur to thunderous projection within a single sentence, so that the audience's nervous system was always slightly off balance, never quite sure what was coming next, and therefore always attending. He told stories, specific, vivid, emotionally charged stories drawn from scripture and from ordinary life, that put the theological argument in a form the imagination could inhabit rather than merely the intellect could accept. And he wept. He wept openly, frequently, and apparently genuinely. And the sight of a grown man weeping for the souls of strangers produced in those strangers a response of profound, emotional reciprocity that Whitefield leveraged with extraordinary effectiveness. His audiences wept in return. And people who weep together in response to the same words are not merely an audience. They are a community. They have been, through the experience of shared emotion produced by shared language, converted from a collection of strangers into something that feels like a family. That conversion, that community building through speech, is perhaps the deepest and most lasting thing that great religious oratory accomplishes. There is a particular kind of speech that only becomes possible when a people have reached a specific and volatile psychological state, when they have been carrying a grievance long enough that it has stopped feeling like a complaint and started feeling like a truth, when the gap between what they were promised and what they have received has grown so wide that the gap itself has become a source of identity, a wound that is also a weapon. This is the psychological state that produces revolutions. And the speakers who ignite revolutions are not, as the comfortable classes have always liked to imagine, the ones who create this state out of nothing. They are the ones who arrive at precisely the moment when the state already exists, when millions of individual resentments and disappointments have accumulated but not yet cohered, and who provide the one thing the moment is missing: the words. Not just any words, but the specific, exact, perfectly calibrated words that take all that diffuse, private, unarticulated feeling and suddenly make it public, shared, named, and therefore actionable. The revolutionary speaker does not light a fire. The fire is already there, burning in the chest of every person who comes to hear them speak. What the speaker provides is the oxygen. To understand how this works in practice, there is no better starting point than a tavern keeper's son from Hanover County, Virginia, who stood up in the colonial House of Burgesses in May of 1765 and said things that no one in that chamber had quite been willing to say before. Things so dangerous that several members walked out in protest, and others, by his own later account, shouted treason before they caught themselves. Patrick Henry was 29 years old, had been a licensed lawyer for only a few months, and had the kind of background that in the rigid class structure of colonial Virginia should have guaranteed his permanent obscurity. He was not well-born. He was not well-educated by the standards of the planter class that dominated Virginia politics. He had failed at farming and failed at shopkeeping before discovering, almost accidentally, that he could do something extraordinary. He could walk into a room full of skeptical, hostile, or indifferent people and, within minutes, have them believing things they had not believed before, feeling things they had not expected to feel, and willing to do things they had not intended to do. This was not a skill he had been taught. It was something he had discovered in himself, honed in the county courthouses where he had built a reputation as a trial lawyer of uncanny power, and now brought to bear on the most dangerous political question in the colonies: the right of the British Parliament to tax Americans who had no representation in that Parliament. What Henry understood, and what the more cautious and conventionally educated members of the Virginia House of Burgesses did not fully grasp, was that the argument against the Stamp Act was not primarily a legal argument. Yes, it could be made in legal terms, and had been, and would be again, but legal arguments reach lawyers and judges. They do not reach farmers. They do not reach tradespeople. They do not reach the vast majority of colonial Americans who had no Latin, no knowledge of constitutional precedent, and no time for abstract principle, but who had a very clear and visceral sense of what it felt like to work hard and then have someone take the product of that work for purposes they had no say in. Henry's genius was to take that feeling, raw, unarticulated, privately held, and give it a frame. Not a legal frame, a moral frame. He didn't argue that the Stamp Act was unconstitutional, though he believed it was. He argued that it was wrong, that it violated something more fundamental than statute, something that every person in the room and every person in the colonies already knew in their bones, even if they didn't yet have the words for it. He gave them the words, and once a people has the words for what they know in their bones, they become a different kind of political force. The specific words of Henry's 1765 speech are lost to us. No transcript was made. and the versions that survive were reconstructed from memory decades later by people who had witnessed the speech but could not perfectly recall it. But the effect of the speech is not lost, because the effect was the passage in modified form of Henry's Virginia Resolves, which declared the colonists' right to be taxed only by their own representatives, a declaration that was reprinted in newspapers up and down the Atlantic seaboard, and that effectively launched the colonial resistance movement that would, a decade later, become a revolution. In the speech Henry gave a decade later, in March of 1775 at the Second Virginia Convention, has come down to us in a form sufficiently reliable that we can analyze it with some confidence. And what we find when we analyze it is a masterpiece of revolutionary rhetoric, a speech so carefully constructed in its apparent spontaneity, so deliberately built in its seemingly passionate outburst, that it deserves to stand alongside the Philippics and the Catilinarian orations in any serious study of how words change the course of human events. The "give me liberty" or "give me death" speech is short, probably no more than 10 minutes in delivery, and it is structured with the precision of a trial lawyer's closing argument disguised as an act of prophetic inspiration. Henry begins not with his conclusion, but with his opposition's argument, stating it in its strongest possible form, and then, piece by piece, dismantling it. This is a technique we saw Lincoln use, and Cicero use, and Demosthenes use. The technique of taking your opponent's best case seriously enough to engage with it fully before showing why it fails. And it is extraordinarily effective for a specific psychological reason. It signals to the audience that the speaker is not afraid of counterargument, which in turn signals confidence, which in turn builds the ethos that makes the audience willing to trust wherever the speaker leads them next. By the time Henry has dispensed with the case for continued hope and reconciliation with Britain, methodically, calmly, with specific evidence, he has earned the right to say what he says next, which is that there is no more time, that the choice is now, and that the choice is binary, either liberty or death. There is no middle option. The simplicity of this framing is not naive. It is strategic because binary choices produce action in a way that complex, nuanced, many-option deliberation never can. Henry had spent the first two-thirds of his speech patiently eliminating the middle ground. The final third simply names the two positions that remain. In a room full of men who had been avoiding the final choice for years, this naming was itself an act of violence, a good violence, a clarifying violence, the violence of a surgeon who cuts in order to heal. The other figure who understood the revolutionary potential of language with comparable sophistication was not primarily a speaker, but a writer who understood that writing, when structured with the cadences and devices of great speech, can have all the impact of an oration and none of its limitations. It can be copied, distributed, carried across borders, read aloud in taverns and churches and town squares, to audiences the original author never met. Thomas Jefferson was perhaps the most gifted prose stylist ever to hold high political office in any country, and the Declaration of Independence, which he drafted in 17 days in June of 1776, is not merely a political document. It is a piece of rhetoric so carefully and so brilliantly constructed that it has been reperformed and repurposed and reinvoked for nearly 2.5 centuries by movements as different as the abolitionists and the suffragettes and the civil rights movement and the Viet Cong, each of whom found in Jefferson's words a mirror of their own aspirations. That extraordinary durability is not accidental. It is the product of specific rhetorical choices that are worth examining in some detail. The Declaration opens with what might be the most important single word in any founding document. When, not because, not we believe, not the following are our reasons, but when that single word does something remarkable. It assumes the existence of a general principle, not yet stated, under which the action being described is justified, and it invites the reader to infer that principle before it is explicitly given. The reader's mind, following the wind, leans slightly forward in a state of mild, pleasant anticipation. And it is in this state of anticipation that the great assertion lands, the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The positioning of this assertion, not as the beginning of the argument, but as its assumed philosophical ground, the bedrock already in place before the building is erected, is a rhetorical trick of breathtaking audacity, because it transforms a contested philosophical claim into a statement of something everyone presumably already knows and accepts, the way you might begin a legal argument with. As everyone in this courtroom understands, what is actually a radical proposition is presented as a commonplace. What is actually a revolutionary idea is presented as something too obvious to require proof. By the time the reader's critical faculties have registered the sleight of hand, the claim is already inside them, already part of their assumed framework, and dismantling it would require dismantling the entire structure of the argument they have just mentally entered. Jefferson's rhythms are equally calculated. The long middle section of the Declaration, listing the grievances against King George, builds through a technique of repeated parallel structure. He has refused, he is forbidden, he is obstructed, he is called together, he has dissolved. That creates a cumulative, almost musical pressure, each iteration adding weight to the previous ones until the whole structure becomes something you feel physically, like a drumbeat accelerating toward its climax. This is anaphora again, the same device King used, the same device Churchill used, the same device that appears in every tradition of powerful speech because it works on the human nervous system in ways that seem to be universal. But what makes Jefferson's deployment of it particularly masterful is the selection of the verbs. Refused, forbidden, obstructed, dissolve. Each one is a verb of violation, of something actively done against the natural order, against the rights that were already established in the opening sentences as self-evident. By the time you have read, he has for the 23rd time, you are not just intellectually convinced that George III has behaved badly. You feel it. You feel it the way you feel injustice done to you personally, not injustice done abstractly to a legal principle. And people who feel injustice personally do not write polite letters requesting reform. They write declarations. Across the Atlantic, the French Revolution produced its own extraordinary rhetorical landscape. More chaotic, more violent, more ideologically fractured than the American equivalent, but equally illuminating about how language functions in times of radical upheaval. The great paradox of French revolutionary rhetoric is that its most technically gifted practitioner, Maximilien Robespierre, was also the man most responsible for its most catastrophic excess, the Terror, and that he used the same rhetorical techniques to send men to the guillotine that he had earlier used to argue for the abolition of the death penalty. Robespierre was known to his contemporaries as the Incorruptible, a title that reflects both his genuine personal austerity and the extraordinary degree to which his public persona had been constructed through the consistent, obsessive self-presentation of a man who had merged his identity with his ideology so completely that attacking one meant attacking both. This merging of speaker with message, this identification of the person with the principle they represent, is a technique of immense rhetorical power, because it means that any criticism of the argument can be presented as an attack on the person, and any attack on the person can be deflected by invoking the purity of the principle. It is a technique that has been used by demagogues of every era, and we will examine its darker applications in a later chapter. But what it demonstrates here is something important. The same rhetorical device can serve radically different masters, depending entirely on the character and intentions of the person wielding it. What the American and French revolutions both demonstrate, when examined through the lens of rhetoric, is that the relationship between language and political change is not linear. It is not the case that a great speech produces an idea, which produces a movement, which produces a revolution. It is more circular and more complicated than that. The great speeches of the Revolutionary era were not the starting points of their revolutions. They were crystallizations, moments when the slow, dispersed, underground work of political change broke through to the surface in a form that was public, shared, and impossible to ignore. Patrick Henry did not create colonial resentment of British taxation. He made that resentment speakable, and speakable resentment is a qualitatively different thing from unspoken resentment, because speakable resentment can be coordinated, can be organized, can be transformed from a private feeling into a public cause. Thomas Jefferson did not invent the idea of human equality. He found words for it so perfect that the idea became, from that moment forward, almost impossible to argue against in the court of public opinion, even by people who were, in their actual behavior, arguing against it every day of their lives. This is the deepest power of the revolutionary speaker, not to create new ideas, but to make existing ideas undeniable, to push them from the periphery to the center of public consciousness with such force that pretending not to see them becomes an increasingly exhausting and eventually impossible act. The techniques that accomplish this are, at their core, the same techniques we have identified in every other tradition of powerful speaking. There is the radical specificity that makes abstractions feel like personal experiences. There is the binary framing that converts complex situations into clear choices. There is the use of rhythm and repetition to bypass critical analysis and work directly on the body. There is the strategic deployment of the self, the speaker as embodiment of the principle, the person as proof of the idea. There is the relentless attention to audience, the calibration of every word to the specific emotional state of the specific people in the room at the specific moment in history when the speech is being delivered. And there is, running underneath all of it, the thing that no technique can manufacture but that every genuinely great speaker in this tradition possessed, the absolute, unfeigned, unperformable conviction that what they were saying was true and that it mattered. Henry believed it. Jefferson believed it. The conviction was not the cause of their rhetoric's power. Their rhetoric was technically brilliant independent of their sincerity. But the conviction was the fuel that sustained the rhetoric through the years of failure and ridicule and danger that preceded the moments of triumph. And it was, in the final analysis, the thing that audiences could sense beneath the words, the thing that told them, at some level below conscious analysis, that this was not a performance. This was real, and things that are real, spoken by people who believe them, in words crafted with enough skill to make them felt rather than merely heard. Those are the things that make history move. There is a particular kind of greatness that disguises itself as simplicity. It does not announce itself with ornament or complexity. It does not dazzle you with the virtuosity of its performance or overwhelm you with the erudition of its references. It arrives quietly, in short sentences, in plain words that a child could understand, and it takes you somewhere so deep and so true that you don't realize how far you have traveled until you look back and find that everything looks different from where you now stand. This is the greatness of Abraham Lincoln, and it is, in some ways, the most difficult kind to analyze, because the techniques that produce the appearance of simplicity are among the most sophisticated in all of rhetoric, and the plainness that seems like an absence of craft is in fact the highest expression of it. When we study Lincoln, we are studying something that looks like nature is actually art. Speeches that feel as if they could not have been otherwise, sentences that seem to have always existed and were merely discovered rather than constructed, and underneath that feeling of inevitability, when you look closely enough, a set of rhetorical decisions so precise and so deliberate that they deserve to be examined with the same careful attention we bring to a mathematical proof or a piece of music by Bach. Lincoln came to language the way most self-made people come to their deepest skills, through hunger. He was born in 1809 in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky, moved to Indiana at 7, and grew up in a world where books were so scarce that he reportedly walked miles to borrow a single volume and read it by firelight when he got home because there was no other light available. He read the King James Bible until its rhythms were in his bloodstream. He read Shakespeare with the devotion of a scholar, memorizing long passages and reciting them to anyone who would listen, and many who would rather not. He read Aesop and Bunyan and Burns, and then he read the law, not in a law school, of which there were none available to him, but by reading Blackstone's commentaries on his own in the intervals between physical labor until he understood it well enough to pass the bar examination. This education, such as it was radically different from that of the Eastern educated men who dominated American political life in his era. Men who had been trained in classical rhetoric, in Latin and Greek, in the formal structures of argumentation that the great universities transmitted. Lincoln had none of that. What he had instead was a direct, unmediated relationship with the English language at its greatest, the language of the King James translators, of Shakespeare, of the Scottish Presbyterians who wrote his country's hymns, a relationship so intimate and so sustained that when he came to write, he did not reach for the conventions of educated discourse. He reached for something older and more fundamental, the rhythms of speech that had been carved into him by years of reading aloud, alone, in the dark. The result was a voice unlike anything American politics had produced before or has produced since. To appreciate how unusual it was, you need to understand the rhetorical culture Lincoln was operating in, a culture that prized exactly the opposite qualities from those Lincoln exemplified. The great American orators of the antebellum period, Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, Edward Everett, were men of elaborate, ornate, Ciceronian grandeur. Their speeches were long, carefully structured, richly elusive, full of classical references and rolling periodic sentences that built to magnificent climaxes. They were designed to impress as much as to persuade, to demonstrate the speaker's learning and culture as well as to advance an argument. And they were admired the way an elaborate building is admired, for the evident skill and labor that had gone into their construction, for the sheer, ambitious scale of the enterprise. Against this standard, Lincoln's stripped-down, direct, almost conversational style seemed like a deficiency. His Springfield neighbors thought him homely in his speech. His political opponents in the East thought him crude. Even many of his supporters worried, before his first inauguration, that he lacked the rhetorical stature that the presidency seemed to require. What they were missing, and what history would make unmistakably clear, was that Lincoln's apparent simplicity was the most perfectly tuned instrument for his particular historical moment that could possibly have been designed. The historical moment was, of course, the dissolution of the American Republic. By the time Lincoln took office in March of 1861, 7 states had already seceded. The republic that the founders had designed, the experiment in democratic self-government that was still, in 1861, a genuinely novel and fragile thing in a world dominated by monarchies and empires, was in the process of tearing itself apart over the question that had been embedded in its founding like a splinter in a wound, the question of slavery, of whether the self-evident truth that all men are created equal actually meant what it said, or whether it had always been understood to apply. Only to some men. Lincoln's rhetorical challenge was unlike anything any American leader had faced before: to hold together a fractured nation, to prosecute a catastrophic war without losing either the military's will or the public support, to manage the radical abolitionist wing of his own party and the conservative unionist wing simultaneously, and to do all of this while articulating, over the course of 4 years of unprecedented slaughter, a vision of what America was and what it was fighting for that, could survive the war and become the foundation for whatever came after. This was not a rhetorical challenge. It was a civilizational one, and Lincoln met it, speech by speech and letter by letter, with a consistency and a depth and a precision of language that stands as one of the greatest sustained rhetorical achievements in human history. The first inaugural address, delivered on March 4th, 1861, with southern states already gone and Civil War matter weeks away, is a study in the rhetoric of desperate conciliation, a speech that had to accomplish the nearly impossible task of holding out the hand of peace while simultaneously drawing a line that could not be crossed. Lincoln had been shown a draft by his Secretary of State, William Seward, who had suggested ending the speech with a passage of warm, conciliatory sentiment designed to appeal to Southern moderates. Lincoln took Seward's suggestion and transformed it into something that Seward could not have written, because what Lincoln added was not warmth, it was music. Seward's draft ended with a competent political appeal. Lincoln's revision ended with one of the most beautiful passages in the history of American prose, the image of the mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone across the broad land, that would yet swell the chorus of the Union when touched, as they surely would be, by the better angels of our nature. Every word in this passage is doing several things at once. Mystic chords takes the abstract idea of national unity and gives it a sensory reality. You can almost hear them. Every battlefield and patriot grave acknowledge the cost that has already been paid for the Union, making the appeal to preserve it not merely sentimental, but earned. Every living heart extends the community of obligation from the dead to the living, making each listener personally implicated. And the better angels of our nature, perhaps the single most quoted phrase Lincoln ever wrote, does something that pure political argument can never do. It appeals not to the audience's interests or their reason, but to their aspiration, to the version of themselves they would prefer to be. It does not say, you should preserve the Union because it benefits you. It says, there is a version of you, your better self, your angelic self, that already knows what the right thing to do is. This is rhetoric at its most profound, not persuasion from the outside in, but an invitation to an internal conversation that the audience was already having with themselves. 2 years later, at Gettysburg, Lincoln delivered the speech that is widely regarded as the greatest in American history, and it is worth spending some time with its specific technical architecture, because that architecture is more deliberate than it appears and more interesting than the speech's famous brevity might suggest. The Gettysburg Address is 272 words long. It contains no flourishes, no complex subordinate clauses, no classical allusions, no elegant variation of the kind that educated writers were trained to produce. It uses, instead, a set of binary oppositions, living and dead, what we say and what they did, what the world will remember and what it cannot forget, that give the speech a structure of almost mathematical elegance, each pair of opposing terms creating a tension that the speech then resolves in the final sentences. The famous opening, "47 years ago," is not, as it might appear, a piece of biblical archaism deployed for decorative effect. It is a calculation, 87 years, which places the founding not at the Constitution of 1787, but at the Declaration of Independence in 1776. This is not accidental. It is the most important political move in the speech, accomplished in the first 5 words, before most people have registered what has happened. Lincoln is redefining the founding moment of America from the compromise-laden Constitution, which permitted slavery and counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, to the Declaration, which said all men are created equal. He is, in the opening phrase of a 2-minute cemetery dedication, quietly but irreversibly changing what America's founding document is. By the time the speech ends, the nation has been rhetorically reconstituted on a different basis from the one it began on, and the war has been given a new meaning. Not the restoration of the old Union, but the completion of the original promise that the old Union had failed to keep. The prose itself is a marvel of what we might call rhetorical compression. The art of putting as much meaning as possible into as few words as possible without any of the meaning being lost. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. This triple negation, with its rising emotional weight as the verbs escalate from the merely official to the merely sacred to the genuinely holy, is built on the same anaphoric structure we have seen in Cicero and King and Churchill. But Lincoln uses it here, not to build positive momentum, but to demolish it, to insist on the insufficiency of anything the living can do in the face of what the dead have already done. The effect is to transfer the moral authority of the occasion from the speaker and the dignitaries on the platform to the soldiers buried in the ground, and to make the audience feel, viscerally, the inadequacy of words in the face of sacrifice, which is itself a profoundly effective rhetorical move. Because an audience that has been made to feel the inadequacy of words is an audience that is not critically analyzing the words being said to them, but simply receiving them, emotionally open and intellectually disarmed. Lincoln is telling his audience that words are not enough, and in doing so he creates a state of mind in which his words go deeper than words normally go. The second inaugural address, delivered in March of 1865 with the war nearly over and Reconstruction looming, is in some ways even more remarkable than Gettysburg, because it attempts something that no other major speech in American history had attempted. It asks the victors of a devastating civil war not to celebrate, but to reflect, not to feel righteous, but to feel humble, not to demand justice, but to extend charity. The theological and rhetorical architecture of the second inaugural is complex and dense in a way that Gettysburg is not. It engages directly with the mystery of divine providence, with the possibility that God had willed the war as punishment for the sin of slavery on both sides, North and South, and that the appropriate response to victory was not triumph but sorrow, with malice toward none, with charity for all. This closing formulation is so famous that we have stopped hearing how radical it is, how completely it inverts the normal emotional logic of military victory, how extraordinarily it demands of its audience that they locate themselves in a moral framework in which they are not simply the righteous side, but participants in a shared national guilt whose expiation has cost 600,000 lives and is not yet complete. No speechwriter would have proposed this to a modern politician. No political consultant would have allowed it through. It is, by any conventional standard, a terrible way to celebrate winning a war. And it is, by any serious rhetorical standard, the most morally ambitious speech any American president has ever given. An attempt to use the power of language not to congratulate or to inflame or to unify through pride, but to transform, to ask a nation emerging from its darkest chapter to be better than its history, better than its anger, better even than its sense of deserved vindication. Whether it succeeded is a question that the subsequent history of Reconstruction makes painfully difficult to answer. But as an act of rhetorical ambition, as an example of a speaker using the full resources of language to attempt something that ought to have been impossible, it has no equal in the American tradition. What Lincoln teaches us, beyond the specific techniques we can identify in his specific speeches, is something about the relationship between character and rhetoric that is easy to state, but difficult to fully absorb. Lincoln was not a great speaker in the conventional sense. He was not particularly impressive to look at. His voice was not what anyone would call beautiful. He was frequently awkward in formal social situations, frequently self-deprecating to the point of discomfort, frequently absent the kind of commanding physical presence that we associate with great leadership. What he had instead was an inner life of extraordinary richness and an absolute, almost savage honesty about himself and about the world. An honesty that refused comfortable illusions, that insisted on seeing things as they actually were rather than as he might have wished them to be, and that then found the words for what he saw with a precision so complete that the words themselves seemed to become what they described. When Lincoln wrote about the cost of the war, you felt that he had counted the cost personally, that the 600,000 dead were not an abstraction to him, but an anguish. And the feeling in the reader or the listener was not the second-hand emotion of witnessing someone else's feeling, but the strange, intimate, almost unbearable sensation of having one's own unspoken feeling exactly named. This is the deepest power of great language. Not to tell us something we didn't know, but to tell us something we already knew but hadn't been able to say. Lincoln said what Americans felt but could not articulate. The grief, the doubt, the terrible cost, the fragile hope. And in saying it, he gave his people the only thing that could see them through. The sense that their suffering was real and known and not in vain. The tragedy of Lincoln's story, the fact that he was killed 6 days after the Confederate surrender and never had the chance to implement the generous and complicated vision of Reconstruction he had been building toward, gives his rhetoric a quality that it might not otherwise have. The quality of the unfinished, of the promissory note that was never fully honored. His words have been invoked by every subsequent generation of Americans reaching for a better version of the country, which suggests that the promises embedded in the language remain operative, remain alive, remain capable of doing work in the world, even a century and a half after the man who spoke them was shot in a theater box and died the following morning. This is, in the end, the most extraordinary thing about the greatest speeches. They do not stay in the past. They travel forward through time, acquiring new meanings and new urgencies as the world changes around them, serving causes and illuminating moments that their original speakers could not have foreseen. The words survive the speaker. The words survive the context. The words survive, if they're good enough, almost everything. And in surviving, they continue to do what they were built to do, to reach inside the human chest and move something there that nothing else can quite reach, in the direction of something better than what was there before. Lincoln built words like that. He built more of them, and built them better than almost anyone who has ever spoken in the long and remarkable history of human beings trying to persuade each other of the truth. There is a moment in the summer of 1940 that exists at the absolute center of the history of political oratory. A moment when a single man's voice was, quite literally, the most important strategic asset his country possessed. Britain had just evacuated its army from the beaches of Dunkirk, leaving behind virtually all of its equipment. France was collapsing. The United States had not yet entered the war. The Soviet Union was still technically an ally of Nazi Germany. Every neutral observer with access to a map and a calculator had concluded that Britain was finished, that the rational course was to negotiate, to find whatever terms could be salvaged from the wreckage, and to avoid the complete destruction that continued resistance seemed to guarantee. The British cabinet itself was divided on exactly this question. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, was pressing for negotiations. The military chiefs were deeply pessimistic, and Winston Churchill, who had been Prime Minister for less than a month, understood something that the map readers and the calculators did not, that the battle Britain was fighting in the summer of 1940 was not primarily a military battle. It was a psychological one, and psychological battles are won with words. To understand what Churchill did in 1940 and why it worked, you need to understand something about the man who did it. A man so complex, so contradictory, so extravagantly himself that any simple account of him immediately feels inadequate. Churchill was 65 years old when he became Prime Minister. He had spent the previous decade in what his contemporaries called the political wilderness, out of office, widely regarded as a reckless and unreliable figure whose judgment had been catastrophically discredited by the Gallipoli disaster of the First World War, whose warnings about Hitler had been dismissed as the belligerence of a man temperamentally incapable of peace. He had spent those wilderness years writing, producing millions of words of history, biography, and journalism, and in the process had developed his prose style to a pitch of excellence that would eventually win him the Nobel Prize in Literature. This is not a coincidental detail. Churchill was a writer who became a war leader, not a war leader who happened to write. And the writing and the leading were, for him, inseparable activities. He understood that the narrative of events was as important as the events themselves, that the story a people told about what was happening to them and why determined how they responded to it, and that the person who controlled the narrative controlled, to a remarkable degree, the response. In 1940, Churchill set out to control the narrative of the most dangerous moment in British history, and he did it with the tools of a writer and the conviction of a man who had been preparing for this moment, consciously or not, for his entire life. The first great speech of Churchill's wartime premiership came on May 13, 1940, 3 days after he had taken office, when he addressed the House of Commons for the first time as Prime Minister. The speech is short, under 15 minutes, and it begins not with reassurance, but with honesty so stark that it must have taken the breath out of the chamber. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. This is, by any conventional standard of political speech-making, a disastrous opening. Political leaders are supposed to offer hope. They are supposed to project confidence. They are supposed to tell the people that things are under control, that capable hands are at the wheel, that there is a plan and the plan will work. Churchill offered none of this. What he offered instead was a pact, the hardest and most honest kind of pact a leader can make with the people, in which the truth of the situation was stated without mitigation, and the people were asked, on the basis of that unvarnished truth, whether they were willing to continue. The effect of this honesty was the opposite of demoralizing. It was galvanizing, because audiences are not, ultimately, as easily comforted by false reassurance as politicians tend to assume. They know, somewhere beneath their desire to be reassured, when they are being lied to. And a leader who tells the truth, who respects them enough to tell the truth, who trusts their capacity to face the truth, creates a bond of credibility and trust that no amount of comfortable fiction can manufacture. When Churchill then stated his aim, victory, however long and hard the road may be, for without victory there is no survival, it landed with a force that a more comfortable opening could not have generated, because it arrived in an audience that had already been asked to be adults, and that had responded by becoming adults. The technical architecture of Churchill's rhetoric is built on a foundation of sound. More than any other major political speaker of the 20th century, Churchill understood that language is music, that the sequence of stressed and unstressed syllables in a sentence creates a rhythm that the body responds to independently of the meaning of the words, and that the most effective political prose is prose that works simultaneously on the ear and the mind. He had studied this consciously and obsessively. As a young man, he had produced an unpublished essay called The Scaffolding of Rhetoric, in which he analyzed, with remarkable precision for a 22-year-old, the technical properties of effective speech, rhythm, accumulation, analogy, and what he called the climax, the building of a sequence toward a single, overwhelming conclusion. He had studied Macaulay and Gibbon for their rhythmic sentences. He had studied Burke and Pitt for their structures of argument. He had studied the King James Bible and Shakespeare for the music of the English language at its greatest. And then he had practiced, relentlessly, producing and revising his speeches with the care of a poet, dictating to secretaries who worked in shifts, revising draft after draft, reading the finished product aloud to test every word against his ear before he was willing to deliver in public. His speeches were, in the most literal sense, composed, worked out in advance, shaped and reshaped until they had the quality he wanted, and then memorized or delivered from a manuscript so thoroughly internalized that the delivery felt spontaneous. The appearance of effortless conviction was the product of enormous, invisible effort, and this combination, the passionate conviction and the invisible craft, is one of the defining signatures of great oratory in every tradition. The speech Churchill delivered to the House of Commons on June 4, 1940, following the completion of the Dunkirk evacuation, is perhaps the best single example of his method at work. The situation addressed was objectively catastrophic. Over 300,000 men had been rescued from the beaches, which was itself a miracle of improvisation. But the army had left behind essentially all of its heavy equipment, and the miracle of survival was easily distinguishable from the disaster of military defeat. Churchill needed to accomplish something that sounds almost paradoxical. He needed to acknowledge the magnitude of the defeat clearly enough that his audience would trust his account of events, while simultaneously reframing the defeat in terms that left room for the resolution and determination that continued resistance required. He did this through an extraordinary piece of structural engineering, spending the first two-thirds of the speech on a detailed, factual, almost clinical account of the military situation, establishing his credibility as an honest narrator before attempting anything emotionally ambitious, and then, in the final third, pivoting to the famous peroration that has echoed through every discussion of Churchill ever since. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. This passage is so famous, has been quoted so many times in so many contexts, that it is almost impossible to hear it fresh, to hear it the way the members of the House of Commons heard it on the afternoon of June 4th, 1940, in a country that had been at war for less than a year and was already staring into an abyss. But it is worth making the effort, because the specific technical choices Churchill made in these sentences are not the obvious ones, and understanding why he made them tells us something important about how language works under extreme pressure. The first thing to notice is the geography. Churchill does not say, "We shall fight everywhere," or "We shall fight as long as necessary." He names specific places, beaches, landing grounds, fields, streets, hills, and in naming them, he does something that the abstraction everywhere cannot do. He places the listener inside a landscape. These are not abstract nouns. They are places you can picture, places your body can inhabit in imagination. The beaches are the beaches you know. The streets are the streets where you live. The hills are the hills of England that you can see from your window. Churchill is not making a political argument. He is building a geography of defiance, a physical, sensory, imaginable world in which the resistance he is calling for is not a strategic option, but a lived reality already unfolding. The second technical choice worth examining is the repetition of "we shall." This is anaphora again, the ancient device of beginning successive clauses with the same words. But Churchill uses it here with a specific modal verb, shall, that carries in English a weight that will does not. Will fight is a prediction. Shall fight is a vow. It carries the weight of commitment, of oath, of something that binds the speaker and cannot be undone. And by repeating "we shall" rather than "I shall," Churchill makes the vow collective, implicating every person in the chamber and, by extension, every person in the country in a commitment they may not have consciously made, but that the repetition of the phrase is busily installing in them as the speech unfolds. This is one of the most remarkable properties of anaphoric repetition in political speech. It doesn't just describe a commitment. It performs one. Each repetition of "we shall" is itself another instance of a vow, so that by the time the passage ends, the audience has heard the commitment made 6 times and has implicitly associated themselves with it 6 times, and the cumulative effect is not merely persuasion, but something closer to enrollment, a feeling of having committed to something, of having crossed a line. That makes retreat psychologically much harder than it was before the speech began. The final phrase, "We shall never surrender," lands with the force of everything that came before it. It is shorter than the preceding clauses. After the geographical specificity of beaches and landing grounds and fields and streets and hills, "never surrender" is pure abstraction, pure will, pure defiance, stripped of location and detail, which gives it a kind of absolute quality that the specific places could not have. And never is doing an enormous amount of work here. It is not, we shall not surrender, or we do not intend to surrender. It is never, the most absolute word in the language of time, the word that closes every door and seals every possibility and makes the commitment total and irrevocable. Churchill had used language to burn the boats. There was no tactical retreat available from a position stated in those terms. The speech had not merely described Britain's determination. It had created it, or rather, it had taken the determination that was latent and potential in the British people and forged it, in the furnace of those specific words in that specific order, into something fixed and real and publicly committed. Churchill's radio broadcasts deserve equal attention because they represent a different dimension of his rhetorical genius, the ability to shift register completely when the medium and the audience changed. The speeches he delivered in the House of Commons were addressed to politicians, to an elite audience trained in parliamentary tradition and capable of appreciating the full complexity of his allusions and his arguments. The radio broadcasts were addressed to everyone, to the farmer in Somerset and the factory worker in Sheffield and the widow in London whose windows had been blown in by a German bomb. Churchill understood the difference and adjusted accordingly, not by simplifying his ideas, but by finding the register in which those ideas could be felt by people who might not be able to articulate why they felt them. The voice itself, that extraordinary, somewhat rumbling, slightly slurred voice that carried traces of his childhood stammer, that was unmistakably individual and unmistakably human, was an instrument he had spent decades learning to control, and what it communicated on the radio, in living rooms across Britain, was not the grandeur of a parliamentary performance, but something more intimate and more sustaining. The sense of a man thinking aloud, a man who felt the weight of what he was carrying and who was carrying it anyway, a man who respected his listeners enough to tell them the truth about how bad things were and trusted them enough to believe they could bear it. That combination of honesty and trust, delivered in a voice that sounded like England itself thinking, was worth more to the British war effort than several divisions of soldiers. It did not change the military situation. It changed the psychological situation. And in a war that was substantially a war of wills, that was the decisive contribution. It is important, in any honest account of Churchill's rhetoric, to acknowledge the shadow side of his gifts, the moments when his rhetorical brilliance served purposes that history has judged harshly. The same Churchill who rallied Britain against Nazi tyranny used the language of civilization and barbarism to justify British imperialism in ways that caused enormous suffering to millions of people across Asia and Africa. The same rhetorical techniques that made his wartime speeches immortal were deployed, earlier in his career, in defensive positions on race and empire that were not merely conventional for their time, but were, even by the standards of his time, toward the extreme end of the spectrum. This is not a footnote to his achievement. It is part of the complete picture of what extraordinary rhetorical power looks like when it is not accompanied by consistent moral clarity, when the craft serves whichever conviction the speaker happens to hold most strongly in a given moment, regardless of whether those convictions are equally defensible. Churchill's wartime speeches are magnificent because the convictions they served, the defense of democracy and human freedom against fascist tyranny, were genuinely magnificent. His imperialist speeches are uncomfortable for the same reason they are rhetorically powerful, because the same techniques that make language compelling in the service of good make it equally compelling in the service of something less good, and the language does not discriminate. This is, perhaps, the most important lesson Churchill teaches us about the nature of rhetorical power. The craft itself is morally neutral. The rhythm of "we shall fight on the beaches" works on the human nervous system, whether the cause it serves is the defense of freedom or the suppression of it. The anaphora builds emotional pressure, whether it is building pressure toward justice or toward injustice. The specific, geographical, sensory language places the listener inside a landscape, whether that landscape is Dunkirk or something far less noble. What gives rhetoric its moral character is not the technique, but the truth, the honesty of the speaker about the nature of the situation, the accuracy of the picture they are painting of the world, the degree to which the emotional response they are cultivating in their audience is proportionate and appropriate to the reality those emotions are being asked to respond to. Churchill in 1940 was telling the truth about the situation in terms so precise and so complete that the emotional response his words produced, the defiance, the determination, the refusal to accept defeat, was exactly the right response to have. That alignment between the rhetorical effect and the reality of the situation is what makes his wartime speeches not merely impressive, but genuinely great. And it is what separates great rhetoric from mere demagoguery, a distinction we will need to examine much more closely before this book is done. What Churchill demonstrated, in the end, was something about the relationship between language and reality that goes beyond technique and beyond politics, and touches something fundamental about what human beings are. We are, at the deepest level, linguistic creatures. We do not merely use language to describe reality. We use language to construct it, to determine, through the stories we tell and the words we choose and the metaphors we live inside, what the world means and what it is possible to do within it. Churchill understood this better than almost any political leader in history. He understood that a nation that believed it could not fight was a nation that could not fight, and that a nation given the right words at the right moment, words precise enough and beautiful enough and true enough to produce genuine conviction rather than mere intellectual assent, was a nation that could do almost anything. He gave Britain those words in the summer of 1940, and Britain, against every rational calculation, did almost anything. The words came first. Everything else followed. That sequence, the words preceding the reality they describe, calling into being through the sheer force of precisely articulated conviction, is not unique to Churchill. But no one in the 20th century demonstrated it more clearly, more dramatically, or at higher stakes than the old man in the war cabinet, dictating in his dressing gown, drinking whiskey at odd hours, revising and revising and revising until he found a sentence that said what he needed it to say, and then walking to the microphone and saying it to a nation that needed to hear it more than it had ever needed anything. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the United States of America was engaged in what was, at its core, a rhetorical war, a battle over the story the country told about itself, over which version of America would be allowed to define itself as the real one. On one side were the defenders of a social order built on racial hierarchy, people who used the language of tradition and states' rights and social stability to maintain a system of legalized oppression that had persisted, in one form or another, since the first enslaved Africans arrived on American shores in 1619. On the other side were the people that system oppressed, who had been developing, in the churches and the colleges and the courtrooms of Black America, a tradition of moral arguments so powerful, so deeply rooted in the founding documents of the Republic and the core texts of the Judeo-Christian tradition, that it would prove, in the end, impossible to answer. The civil rights movement was many things: a legal movement, a political movement, an act of collective courage of extraordinary dimensions. But it was also essentially a rhetorical movement, and it produced, in the space of a single decade, two of the greatest speakers the English language has ever known. They disagreed about almost everything except the injustice of what they were fighting, and their disagreement, expressed in two radically different rhetorical styles, illuminates something fundamental about the relationship between language, audience, and political change that no single speaker, however great, could demonstrate alone. Martin Luther King Jr. was, in the most literal sense, born into oratory. His father was a Baptist preacher. His maternal grandfather was a Baptist preacher. He grew up in the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, surrounded from infancy by a tradition of spoken language so rich, so layered, so technically sophisticated and emotionally powerful that absorbing it was simply part of what it meant to grow up in that world. The African American church tradition that King inherited was, as we noted in an earlier chapter, a synthesis of remarkable complexity, combining the structural architecture of classical rhetoric with the musical sensibility of the Negro spirituals, the prophetic urgency of the Old Testament, the call and response dynamics of West African oral tradition, and the democratic idealism of the American founding documents into something that was simultaneously ancient and urgently contemporary, simultaneously specifically Black and universally human. King did not merely inherit this tradition. He studied it with the rigor of an academic, which he also was, holding a doctorate in systematic theology for Boston University. And then he deployed it with the instincts of an artist and the strategic intelligence of a general. What emerged from this combination was a rhetorical style so complete, so perfectly tuned to its moment and its audience and its purpose, that it stands as the fullest single expression of what human speech can accomplish when every element of the craft is operating at its highest level simultaneously. To understand what King did technically, the best place to start is not his most famous speech, but one of his earlier ones. The address he delivered at the Holt Street Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, on the evening of December 5, 1955, the night the Montgomery bus boycott began. King had been given almost no notice that he would be speaking. He had roughly 20 minutes to prepare remarks for an audience that would fill the church and overflow into the streets outside. An audience that was simultaneously terrified and furious and uncertain, that had taken an enormous risk in refusing to ride the buses, and that needed, in the next 30 minutes, to be transformed from a frightened crowd into a disciplined movement. King arrived with almost nothing prepared. What he had instead was 26 years of absorbed tradition, a doctoral-level understanding of the theology and philosophy of nonviolent resistance, and an instinctive genius for reading an audience and giving it exactly what it needed to feel in order to do what it needed to do. The speech he delivered that evening is, by the cold assessment of rhetorical analysis, one of the most structurally perfect pieces of improvisational oratory in recorded history. A speech that established the entire moral and tactical framework of the civil rights movement in under 30 minutes, that simultaneously validated the audience's anger and directed it into disciplined channels, that made the specific situation of Montgomery's Black citizens feel like a manifestation of a universal human struggle. And that did all of this in language that a 12-year-old could follow and a theologian could admire. The specific techniques King used at Holt Street and then refined over the subsequent decade are numerous, but the most important, the one that underlies everything else and makes all the other techniques work, is what might be called the technique of the double audience. Every King speech is addressed to two audiences simultaneously: the Black audience in the room, whose support and courage and sustained commitment he's trying to cultivate, and the white audience beyond the room, the moderates, the undecided, the people of genuine conscience who might be persuaded to support civil rights if the movement was presented in terms they could morally accept. This double address required King to calibrate every element of his rhetoric with extraordinary care, because the two audiences had different needs, different fears, and different relationships to the movement's goals. The Black audience needed validation, needed to hear someone say clearly and without apology that their suffering was real, that their anger was justified, that their humanity was not in question. The white audience needed reassurance, needed to feel that the movement was not a threat to them, that it was asking them to live up to their own stated values rather than to abandon them, that joining the cause of civil rights was an act of American patriotism rather than a betrayal of American tradition. King found a way to speak to both of these needs simultaneously, in the same words, through a rhetorical architecture of such sophistication that each audience heard, in identical phrases, the specific message it needed. The mechanism by which he accomplished this is the invocation of shared texts. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Bible, as the common ground on which both audiences stood, the texts whose authority both audiences acknowledged, the mirror in which both audiences could see their professed values reflected back at them. When King stood at the Lincoln Memorial on August 28, 1963, and spoke of cashing a check, of the promissory note that the founders had signed and that America had not yet honored, he was doing something that was at once emotionally resonant for the Black Americans who had spent generations waiting for the check to be honored, and intellectually compelling for the white Americans who believed in the founding promise and were being asked, simply, to be consistent about it. The metaphor of the bad check is not an attack on America. It is a demand for accountability to America's own standards, and this framing, this insistence on holding America to its own ideals rather than rejecting those ideals as irredeemably tainted, was the most strategically brilliant choice in the entire rhetorical architecture of the civil rights movement. It made the movement impossible to answer on its own terms, because to answer it you had to either deny the founding ideals, which no politician was willing to do in public, or concede that those ideals demanded exactly what the movement was demanding. The rhetorical trap was perfect, and King had said it with the precision of a master craftsman. The "I Have a Dream" speech, delivered at the climax of the March on Washington, is the fullest and most complete expression of King's method, and its technical architecture is worth examining in some detail, because it is more deliberately constructed than its apparently spontaneous emotional power might suggest. The speech was written in advance. King and his advisors worked on it through the night before the march. But the famous dream sequence that forms its emotional climax was largely improvised in the moment, inspired by a prompt from the gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, who shouted from behind him, "Tell them about the dream, Martin," as the prepared text was running out. What happened next was not improvisation in the sense of making something up from nothing. It was improvisation in the musician's sense, the deployment in real time of deeply internalized material that had been developed and rehearsed in earlier speeches and now arrived, in this moment, in its most fully realized form. The dream sequence King delivered at the Lincoln Memorial on August 28, 1963, had been building for years. He had used versions of it in speeches in Detroit and in Albany and in Birmingham. But at the Lincoln Memorial, with 250,000 people in front of him and the weight of the entire movement behind him, it arrived at a pitch of intensity and beauty that it had never quite reached before, because the moment called for everything he had and he gave everything he had. The result was not a speech. It was an event, something that happened to the people present in a way that changed them and that they would carry inside them for the rest of their lives. The specific rhetorical devices in the dream sequence are by now well enough known that there's a risk of analyzing them into meaninglessness, but they bear one more careful examination because they demonstrate something important about how different technical elements reinforce each other when they are all working at maximum effectiveness simultaneously. The anaphora of "I have a dream" builds cumulative emotional pressure in the way we have discussed, each repetition adding to the weight of the previous ones. But what makes King's deployment of it different from a merely mechanical application of the technique is the content he places under each repetition. Content that is specific, geographical, physically imagined, and carefully sequenced from the most specific and politically immediate to the most universal and transcendent. He begins with the specific reality of Mississippi and Alabama, the places where the violence was most extreme and the oppression most visible, and he moves toward the vision of his own children being judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The most universal formulation of the dream's aspiration, the statement that most fully escapes the specific history of American racism and reaches toward a human ideal that transcends time and place. This movement, from the specific and particular toward the universal and transcendent, is the structural spine of the entire speech, and it creates a feeling of ascent, of rising from the muddy particulars of American racial injustice toward a vision of human possibility so elevated that it seems to belong to a different category of experience from the specific grievances that preceded it. And then there is the music. King's prose is, in the deepest sense, musical, built on rhythmic patterns that derive from the Black church tradition, and that produce, in a live audience, a physical response that is essentially identical to the response produced by music. The call and response structure of the church, in which the preacher makes a statement and the congregation responds, creating a dialogue that builds emotional energy through its back and forth rhythm, was deployed by King not as an explicit liturgical structure, but as an implicit one, baked into the rhythm and phrasing of his sentences in ways that invited the audience to respond even when they weren't explicitly asked to. When King said, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last," he was not merely quoting the old spiritual for its content. He was invoking the entire musical and emotional architecture of Black church worship, placing the audience inside a familiar sacred form and using that form's emotional power to lift the political aspiration to the level of the religious. The movement from politics to religion, from the specific to the transcendent, from the contingent to the eternal. This is what the music in King's Rhetoric accomplishes, and it is what gives his greatest speeches a quality that purely political speeches, however brilliant, cannot achieve. The quality of the sacred, of something that feels not merely true, but holy. Malcolm X was everything King was not, and his rhetoric was built on principles that were, in almost every technical respect, King's mirror image. Where King built toward transcendence, Malcolm stayed defiantly on the ground. Where King addressed two audiences simultaneously, Malcolm addressed one, and did it with a directness and an intimacy that was, in its own way, as technically remarkable as anything King ever did. Where King's language moved toward the universal, Malcolm's moved toward the specific, the immediate, the physically concrete reality of life in the Black urban neighborhoods of the American North, the specific texture of poverty and humiliation and police violence and institutional exclusion that King's Southern-inflected, church-rooted, theologically sophisticated rhetoric sometimes failed to reach. Malcolm reached it every time, because he had lived it in ways that King had not, and because he had developed, through years of street corner speaking and prison study and Nation of Islam organizing, a rhetorical style perfectly calibrated to make the people who had lived that experience feel seen, named, and understood in a way that no one else had ever quite managed to do. Malcolm's primary rhetorical weapon was what we might call the rhetoric of clarity, the deployment of blunt, unvarnished, ruthlessly specific language to name things that the polite discourse of civil rights politics had been carefully avoiding naming. Where King spoke of the promissory note unpaid and the check that had bounced, Malcolm spoke of the boot on the neck and the hand in the pocket, and the lie told so often it had begun to sound like truth. Where King addressed white Americans as potential allies who needed to be invited into the cause, Malcolm addressed Black Americans as people who had been injured and who needed, before anything else, to understand the nature and the source of their injury with complete clarity. This difference in rhetorical strategy reflected a genuine difference in political philosophy. Malcolm was, for most of his public life, deeply skeptical of the integration model that King championed, but it was also a difference in audience analysis. Malcolm understood something about the specific psychological situation of northern urban Black Americans that King's rhetoric, designed for a different context, did not always reach. That people who have been told all their lives that their suffering is their own fault, that they are inferior, that the system that excludes them is legitimate and fair, need, before they can be organized into a movement, to have those lies stripped away. They need the clarity of an accurate diagnosis before they can use the prescription that follows. Malcolm's famous distinction between the house Negro and the field Negro is a perfect example of this technique. The use of vivid, physical, historically grounded metaphor to make a complex political argument about accommodation and resistance feel completely, viscerally clear. The image works because it is specific. It places the audience in a specific historical moment, in a specific physical environment, and because it carries no abstraction, no qualification, no diplomatic softening. It says, in the most direct terms possible, that there are black people who have identified with their oppressors and black people who have not, and that the choice between these positions is the most important choice that black Americans face. You can agree or disagree with Malcolm's politics. You cannot claim not to understand what he is saying. That clarity, that absolute refusal of the vague, the diplomatic, the carefully hedged, was itself a political act, because in a discourse that had become almost entirely managed, almost entirely conducted in language designed to reassure rather than to clarify, Malcolm's insistence on saying exactly what he meant was experienced as a form of liberation. His physical delivery was unlike anything else in American political life, where King built toward emotional climaxes through sustained rhythmic pressure. Malcolm worked through a kind of controlled, almost surgical precision. The precise word placed with such exactness that it did not need emotional amplification to land with force. He spoke quickly and clearly, with none of the musical elongation of the black church tradition, and his facial expressions and hand gestures were those of a man making an airtight argument rather than a man bearing witness to a spiritual experience. He made direct eye contact with his audience with an intensity that was, by all accounts of people who heard him speak, almost disconcerting, the feeling of being truly seen by someone who was not going to let you look away. He used humor with devastating effect, a dry, ironic, deeply black humor that landed on the specific absurdities of American racial politics with a precision that exposed their ridiculousness in ways that moral argument alone could not. His audiences laughed, and the laughter was itself a kind of liberation, the release of something that had been held under pressure for too long, the recognition, in the joke, of a truth that had previously only been felt but not spoken. The relationship between King and Malcolm was more complex and more productive than the conventional narrative of their opposition suggests. They met exactly once, briefly, in a Senate corridor in 1964, and they exchanged words for less than a minute before the photographers swarmed them. But they were, throughout their parallel careers, in constant rhetorical dialogue with each other, aware of each other, responding to each other, sometimes explicitly and sometimes implicitly. King needed Malcolm, in a specific political sense. Malcolm's presence on the radical edge of the movement made King's demands seem moderate and negotiable by comparison, creating the kind of political space that the legislation King wanted actually required. Malcolm needed King, in a different sense. King's moral framework and his insistence on the democratic ideals of the founding documents kept the movement anchored in a set of values that could command the broadest possible coalition. Together, as a rhetorical system rather than as individuals, they cover the entire emotional and political terrain of the black freedom struggle. King addressing the conscience of white America, Malcolm addressing the dignity of black America, each one making the other more effective by existing, by speaking, by refusing to be silent. Both men were killed before they turned 40. King was assassinated in Memphis in April of 1968. Malcolm was assassinated in New York in February of 1965. The speeches they left behind have not stopped working. King's "I Have a Dream" has become, in the half-century since its delivery, something close to a secular scripture, a text that has been invoked in contexts far beyond its original one, that has been quoted by presidents and school children and protesters on every continent, that has acquired with each passing decade a new layer of meaning as the dream it describes remains, in specific and painful ways, still unrealized. Malcolm's speeches have undergone a different kind of afterlife, recovered and amplified by each successive generation of Black Americans who found in his uncompromising clarity a vocabulary for their own experience, who discovered in his refusal to soften or qualify or apologize a model of self-possession that the politer tradition of civil rights rhetoric had not provided. The two voices, so different in technique and in temperament and in political vision, together constitute the fullest and most complete expression of what rhetoric in the service of justice looks like. Not the comfortable, manageable, easily assimilated version of justice, but the real thing, with all its complexity and its cost, spoken by men who knew the cost personally and paid it with their lives. What the civil rights movement demonstrates, through King and Malcolm and the hundreds of other extraordinary speakers it produced, is something that this book has been building toward from its first pages. That great oratory is never merely about technique. The technique is essential. Without the craft, the conviction remains private and inaccessible, locked inside the speaker rather than transferred to the audience. But the technique serves something, and what it serves determines, in the final analysis, whether the speech is merely impressive or genuinely transformative. The technique serves the truth, the specific, costly, carefully observed truth about the situation the speaker and the audience share. King's truth was the truth of the gap between America's promise and America's practice, felt as a personal wound and expressed as a universal aspiration. Malcolm's truth was the truth of what that gap felt like to live inside, day by day, in the specific neighborhoods, and under the specific policies, and in the specific humiliations of American racism. Both truths were real. Both truths needed to be spoken. And the voices that spoke them were so precisely calibrated to the truths they carried that they produced, in the end, what great rhetoric always produces when it is working at the highest level. Not merely changed minds, not merely moved emotions, but a transformation of the available reality, a world in which things that had previously been unspeakable were now spoken, things that had been invisible were now seen, things that had been accepted as permanent were now understood to be contingent, challengeable, and ultimately changeable by people willing to stand up and say, in the right words, at the right moment, that they would accept them no longer. Everything we have learned in the preceding chapters about how great rhetoric works, the emotional architecture, the strategic repetition, the specific imagery, the exploitation of shared identity, the binary framing that converts ambiguity into certainty, the building of a speaker's persona into an embodiment of the people's deepest needs. All of it works in the same direction regardless of what it is pointed at. This is the fact that every honest study of rhetoric must eventually confront, the fact that makes the subject not merely academically interesting, but morally urgent. The techniques of persuasion do not discriminate between truth and falsehood, between justice and its opposite, between the elevation of human possibility and its systematic destruction. The same properties of a human mind that make it responsive to the genuine moral urgency of a Lincoln or a King make it equally responsive, in some circumstances, more responsive, to the manufactured urgency of a demagogue. The same hunger for meaning and community and narrative that the great speakers of history have fed with truth can be fed with lies. And the lies, if they are constructed with sufficient craft and delivered with sufficient conviction, will produce emotional responses indistinguishable from those produced by the truth. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It is the conclusion that the 20th century wrote in the blood of 70 million people, and it cannot be avoided in any serious study of what language at its most powerful is capable of doing to human beings. The word demagogue comes from the Greek demos, the people, and agoagos, a leader, and it originally carried no particular negative charge. A demagogue was simply a leader of the people, a popular speaker, someone who could move a crowd. The negative connotation developed gradually as Greeks observed that the ability to move crowds was not always accompanied by wisdom or virtue, that the skills of popular persuasion could be, and frequently were used by people whose actual intentions toward the people they were persuading were something other than benevolent. Plato, who hated rhetoric with a passion that bordered on the obsessive, identified the demagogue as the central threat to democratic governance. The person who exploited the emotional susceptibility of the masses to acquire power that they then used for their own ends rather than the common good. His diagnosis was not wrong, though his prescription, rule by philosopher kings rather than popular participation, carried its own catastrophic risks. The problem Plato identified remains as real and as dangerous today as it was in Athens 24 centuries ago. And to understand it fully, to really understand what it looks like when rhetorical power is weaponized in the service of something terrible, there is no avoiding the most uncomfortable case study in modern history: the speeches of Adolf Hitler. Hitler's oratorical power is a subject that most people prefer not to examine closely, because examining it requires sitting with a deeply uncomfortable reality that the man who orchestrated the Holocaust, who built the apparatus of industrial mass murder, who unleashed on Europe the most destructive war in human history, was not, in any simple sense, a lunatic whose appeal was simply the appeal of madness to the mad. He was, by the overwhelming testimony of people who heard him speak, including people who despised his politics, including educated, sophisticated, thoughtful people who had every reason to resist his appeal, an extraordinarily effective public speaker whose emotional power over live audiences was something most of his contemporaries had never encountered before and were not equipped to defend against. Understanding why this was so is not an act of admiration. It is an act of essential self-defense, because the techniques he used did not die with him in the Berlin bunker. They are alive and available, and they have been used in modified forms and with varying degrees of success by demagogues in every subsequent generation. You cannot protect yourself or your society from something you refuse to understand. And so we look. Hitler began his political career as what most observers considered a minor and somewhat ridiculous figure, a failed painter and Austrian drifter who had ended up in Munich, who had the mannerisms of a passionate crank rather than a serious political leader, and whose speeches in the beer halls of Munich in the early 1920s were initially dismissed by sophisticated observers as the ravings of an excitable provincial. What those observers missed, because they were evaluating him by the standards of the educated, formal, parliamentary oratory they were accustomed to, was that Hitler was not performing for them. He was performing for a completely different audience, for the men who filled those beer halls, men who had survived the trenches of the First World War and returned to a Germany that had treated them as losers rather than as veterans, men who were watching their savings destroyed by hyperinflation and their social status eroded by economic chaos. Men who had been told that their country's humiliating defeat was the result not of military failure, but of betrayal, a stab in the back by Jews, and communists and cosmopolitan elites who had never believed in Germany and never would. This story, the stab in the back myth, the Dolchstoß, was a lie. It was a lie that Germans told themselves because the truth, which was that they had simply lost a war they had started, was too painful to accept. And Hitler did not create this lie. He found it already circulating, already partially believed, and he gave it the specific, vivid, emotionally supercharged language it needed to become not merely a theory, but a conviction. The kind of conviction that does not respond to counterargument, because it is not held in the part of the mind that processes arguments. His technique in the beer halls was, at its core, a technique of emotional amplification through physical performance. He understood, partly through instinct, partly through conscious study of crowds and crowd psychology, that a live audience is not a collection of individuals making independent judgments. It is a social organism whose emotional state can be managed, directed, and amplified by a skilled performer in ways that override individual critical faculties entirely. He began his speeches slowly, speaking quietly, almost hesitantly, in a way that was initially disappointing to audiences expecting the passionate orator they had heard about. This was deliberate. The quiet opening established intimacy, the sense of a man thinking through a problem with the audience rather than declaiming at them, while simultaneously frustrating the expectation of immediate intensity, creating a mild tension that would be released later with multiplied force. As the speech progressed, his pace quickened and his voice rose by carefully calibrated increments until he was speaking with a physical intensity, the shaking fists, the bulging eyes, the voice breaking with something that looked and sounded like genuine emotion that audiences found overwhelming. The intensity was not fake, precisely, but it was also not spontaneous. It was rehearsed, photographically documented by his personal photographer Heinrich Hoffmann, and refined over years of performance until every gesture had been tested and every vocal modulation had been calibrated for maximum emotional impact. What Hitler was generating through this escalating physical performance was a specific emotional state in his audience that psychologists would later identify as a form of collective arousal, a state in which individual judgment is suspended, social inhibitions are released, and the crowd functions as a single emotional organism rather than a collection of separate thinking individuals. This state has been studied extensively since the Second World War, and what the research shows is deeply unsettling. In a state of collective arousal, people are capable of accepting propositions they would instantly reject if they encountered them in calm, private, individual reflection. They are capable of feeling certainty about things for which there is no evidence. They are capable of directing enormous emotional energy, including violent energy, toward targets designated by the person who produced the arousal state. Hitler understood this not as a psychological theory, but as a practical technique, and he used it to install in his audience's beliefs and hatreds and loyalties that were, by any calm analysis, both false and catastrophic, but that felt, in the moment of their installation, like the deepest and most obvious truths the audience had ever encountered. The content of Hitler's speeches, the specific lies and the specific hatreds, was delivered wrapped in a rhetorical structure borrowed, consciously or unconsciously, from the tradition of religious oratory. He presented himself not as a politician offering a platform, but as a prophet delivering a revelation, a man chosen by fate or destiny or the spirit of the German people to speak truths that others have been too cowardly or too compromised to speak. This persona, the truth-teller surrounded by liars, the prophet surrounded by false priests, the pure man of the people surrounded by corrupt elites, is one of the oldest and most powerful archetypes in human culture, and Hitler exploited it with extraordinary effectiveness. By positioning himself as the voice of a truth that had been suppressed, he made every criticism of his positions feel like evidence of the suppression rather than evidence of the position's falsehood. The sophisticated critics who pointed out that his economics made no sense and his history was fabricated were not refuting him. They were, in the emotional logic his rhetoric had created, proving him right, proving that the establishment was determined to silence the man who was telling the people the truth. This is the most insidious feature of demagogic rhetoric. It is self-sealing, designed to convert its own refutation into confirmation, to make every attack on it feel like evidence of the conspiracy it claims to be exposing. The Nuremberg rallies, which Hitler and Albert Speer designed together beginning in 1933, represent the furthest extension of this logic into pure theatrical spectacle, the point at which the speech itself becomes almost secondary to the total rhetorical environment in which it is embedded. The rallies lasted for days and were organized as a precisely choreographed assault on every sense simultaneously. The vast architectural scale of the rally grounds, designed to dwarf the individual and make them feel part of something immeasurably larger than themselves. The synchronized movement of hundreds of thousands of uniform bodies, which created the visual impression of a single vast organism operating with perfect collective will. The torchlight and searchlights that turned the night sky into a cathedral of light, producing what Speer himself called a cathedral of ice, a transcendent aesthetic experience designed to associate the Nazi movement with the sacred, with the sublime, with something that demanded the same surrender of individual judgment that great religious experience demands. By the time Hitler spoke, the audience had already been prepared by hours of music and pageantry and collective physical performance, had already been brought into the state of collective arousal in which individual critical faculties were suspended, and the speech itself was simply the verbal crystallization of an emotional experience that had already been accomplished through other means. The words mattered less than the context in which they were delivered, and the context had been engineered with the precision of a military operation to make those words land with the force of divine revelation. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, was in many ways the more technically sophisticated thinker about rhetoric, and his insights, however horrifying their applications, deserve careful examination because they illuminate something about the relationship between mass media and mass persuasion that remains urgently relevant. Goebbels understood, earlier and more clearly than almost anyone else in his era, that the new mass media of radio and cinema were not simply faster and more efficient ways of delivering traditional communication. They were qualitatively different. They created new kinds of audiences and new kinds of psychological relationships between those audiences and the messages they received, and they required new rhetorical strategies to exploit them effectively. His most important insight was what might be called the principle of the emotional shortcut, the recognition that in a mass media environment, where people were receiving enormous quantities of information from multiple sources, the message that cut through is not the most accurate or the most complex, but the most emotionally immediate, the one that connected most directly with something the audience already feared or desired or hated, with the least cognitive mediation between stimulus and response. Repetition was essential, not the thoughtful repetition of the rhetorician who returns to a theme from different angles, enriching it with each recurrence, but mechanical repetition, the same simple phrases repeated so many times across so many channels that they ceased to feel like arguments and began to feel like facts, part of the background texture of reality rather than contested claims requiring evaluation. This is the most important technical distinction between demagogic rhetoric and genuinely great rhetoric, and it is worth stating with precision because the two can be superficially very similar. The great speakers we have examined in preceding chapters, Lincoln, Churchill, King, all used repetition, all used emotional appeal, all understood the importance of connecting with their audiences at the level of feeling rather than merely at the level of reason. But they used these techniques in the service of something that was, by any honest evaluation, true, or at least in the service of positions that could withstand scrutiny and that remained compelling when the emotional temperature dropped and the audience was able to reflect calmly on what they had heard. The test of genuine rhetoric, as opposed to demagoguery, is not the presence or absence of emotion. It is whether the emotion the speech produces is proportionate and appropriate to the reality the speech describes. Whether feeling angry after hearing the speech is an accurate response to a genuine injustice, or whether feeling angry is a response to a fabricated threat manufactured by a speaker who needed someone's anger directed at a target they had chosen. Churchill's finest hour speech made people feel determined and defiant because they were genuinely in a situation that required determination and defiance. Hitler's beer hall speeches made people feel furious and persecuted because the speaker needed them to feel furious and persecuted, whether or not the facts of their situation warranted those feelings. The emotional experience was similar. The relationship to reality was not. Benito Mussolini deserves attention in any discussion of 20th century demagoguery because he represents a somewhat different rhetorical type from Hitler. More theatrical, more explicitly performative, more consciously constructed as a kind of political theater rather than a religious experience. Mussolini was, before he was a politician, a journalist and a schoolteacher, and his rhetorical style bore the marks of both professions. The journalist's instinct for the striking phrase and the arresting image, and the teacher's instinct for the clear, simple statement of complex ideas in terms an unsophisticated audience could grasp and retain. His balcony speeches, delivered from the Palazzo Venezia in Rome to crowds that sometimes numbered in the hundreds of thousands, were masterpieces of physical theater, built around a persona of hypermasculine authority. The jutting chin, the folded arms, the long, contemptuous pauses, the sudden explosive shifts from quiet to thunder that kept audiences in a constant state of slightly anxious attentiveness. He understood the balcony as a stage set and himself as its lead actor, and he managed the crowd below him the way a conductor manages an orchestra, building tension and releasing it, soliciting responses and directing their energy, creating through the alternation of challenge and reward a relationship of intense emotional dependency between himself and his audience that was, in its structure, more closely related to a certain kind of abusive interpersonal relationship than to anything we normally associate with political leadership. What both Mussolini and Hitler demonstrate, beyond the specific techniques they employed, is the extraordinary importance of what might be called a narrative of victimhood and destiny as a tool of demagogic mobilization. In both cases, the rhetorical foundation was the same. A proud and great people had been humiliated by treacherous enemies and corrupt leaders, and now, at the darkest hour, a man had arisen who alone could see clearly enough and feel deeply enough and act decisively enough to restore what had been stolen. This narrative, the fallen greatness, the treacherous enemies, the saving leader, is ancient. It appears in mythologies across the world. It corresponds to deep psychological structures in the human experience of group identity. And it is precisely because of that correspondence enormously dangerous, because it can be activated in virtually any population that has experienced genuine grievance. And virtually every population has experienced genuine grievance, because history is full of genuine injustice. The demagogue does not invent the grievance. He finds it, inflames it, strips it of its complexity, identifies a simple and vulnerable target to blame for it, and positions himself as the instrument of its redress. The grievance may be real. The diagnosis is almost always false. And by the time the audience has understood this, it is frequently too late. The post-war study of how this happened, how educated, culturally sophisticated European societies fell under the spell of fascist rhetoric and participated in, or failed to prevent, the worst atrocities in recorded history, produced a literature of great importance and considerable anguish. Hannah Arendt's analysis of the banality of evil and Theodor Adorno's work on the authoritarian personality were both, at their core, attempts to understand how language and rhetoric interacted with psychology and social structure to produce mass complicity in horror. Viktor Klemperer, a German Jewish philologist who survived the Nazi era in Dresden, kept a meticulous diary documenting the changes in the German language under Nazi rule. The way specific words were corrupted, inflated, drained of meaning, or weaponized, so that the very medium of thought was gradually contaminated until it became almost impossible to think clearly about what was happening. His book, published after the war as The Language of the Third Reich, is one of the most important works ever written about rhetoric, because it demonstrates something that few people fully appreciate before they have read it, that the corruption of language is not merely a symptom of political corruption. It is one of its primary mechanisms. When words lose their precise meanings, when the connection between language and reality is systematically severed, when peace means war and liberation, means conquest and protection, means persecution, the human capacity to accurately assess the world around them is crippled in the most fundamental way possible, at the level of the tool they use to think with. This insight, that demagogic rhetoric does not merely mislead people about specific facts, but corrupts the very instrument by which facts are evaluated, is perhaps the most important contribution that the dark history of 20th century demagoguery makes to our understanding of language and power. It suggests that the defense against rhetorical manipulation is not simply skepticism about specific claims, not simply fact-checking the assertions made by powerful speakers, not even the development of critical thinking skills in the conventional academic sense. The deeper defense is something more fundamental. The cultivation of sensitivity to language itself, an attentiveness to the way words are being used, the way emotional responses are being manufactured, the way the simplification of complexity serves some interests while obscuring others, the way the narrative of victimhood and destiny activates ancient psychological templates in ways that bypass the rational faculties entirely. This is a skill that must be actively developed because our default state is vulnerability. We are built as a species to respond to compelling narrative and emotional appeal, and the demagogue exploits this with a precision that the merely honest speaker, making the merely accurate argument in a merely measured tone, cannot always match. The uncomfortable truth that the history of demagoguery leaves us with is this: the tools are neutral, the vulnerabilities are human and universal, and the protection available to any society depends not on the absence of people willing to exploit those vulnerabilities. Such people have always existed and always will, but on the presence of a population educated enough about how rhetoric works to recognize manipulation when they encounter it, brave enough to name it publicly when they do, and possessed of sufficient alternative sources of meaning and community that the demagogues offer. The terrible, intoxicating offer of absolute certainty and absolute belonging and an absolute enemy to hate can be recognized for what it is and refused. This is a high standard. History suggests it is not always met, but history also suggests that it can be met, that there have been moments, in enough places and at enough times, when a people with enough of the right kind of education and enough of the right kind of institutional strength looked at the man on the balcony or behind the microphone and saw not the prophet, not the savior, not the voice of their deepest truth, but the mechanic of manipulation, the exploiter of fear, the skilled and dangerous craftsman using the tools of language not to illuminate the world but to set it on fire, learning to see that distinction, to feel it, to trust it, to act on it when it matters most, is perhaps the most important thing that studying the history of rhetoric can teach us. The tools are the same. The difference is everything. On the evening of September 26th, 1960, two men sat down in a television studio in Chicago and changed the nature of political rhetoric forever. John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon were both intelligent, both well-prepared, both experienced political communicators who had spent years developing their speaking styles in front of live audiences. By the traditional measures of oratorical performance, argument, evidence, command of policy detail, the debate between them was reasonably close, and many listeners who heard it on the radio believed Nixon had performed adequately or even slightly better. But the 70 million Americans who watched it on television did not experience it as close. They experienced it as a rout. Kennedy, tanned and relaxed and dressed in a dark suit that photographed well against the studio background, looked precisely like what the new medium required. A man completely at home in the present moment. A man whose inner life and outer presentation were in such perfect alignment that the camera, that merciless instrument of involuntary revelation, found nothing to contradict. Nixon, pale from a recent hospitalization, sweating under lights he had not properly prepared for, his 5 o'clock shadow darkening as the evening progressed, his eyes darting occasionally to the camera in a way that read as shifty rather than engaged, looked like a man working very hard to be somewhere he didn't quite belong. The words were almost beside the point. The screen had introduced an entirely new dimension to the ancient art of persuasion, and neither politics nor rhetoric would ever be the same. To understand how profound this transformation was, you need to appreciate what television does that no previous medium of mass communication had done before. Radio, which Churchill had used with such mastery, transmitted voice, the tone, the rhythm, the emotional coloring of speech, but left the listener to construct their own image of the speaker from those vocal signals alone. Print transmitted argument and evidence with great precision, but stripped away almost everything else. The body, the voice, the physical presence that Aristotle had identified as central to the construction of ethos. The live speech transmitted everything simultaneously: body, voice, argument, presence, but was limited to the audience that could physically attend. Television transmitted everything the live speech transmitted to audiences of a size that no live venue could accommodate. And it did something else besides. It placed the speaker not on a distant stage, but in the intimate space of the living room, a few feet from the viewer's face, in the same physical register as family members and trusted friends. This change of scale, from the platform to the living room, was not a cosmetic difference. It was a transformation of the entire psychological relationship between speaker and audience, and it demanded a completely different set of rhetorical skills from those that the platform had rewarded. The platform rewards projection, the throwing of voice and personality across a large physical space to reach an audience whose most distant members are hundreds of feet away. The living room rewards intimacy, the sense of genuine personal connection, of a one-to-one conversation between the speaker and each individual viewer, of a human being present enough and real enough that the viewer feels, however irrationally, that they are being seen as well as addressed. These are not merely different degrees of the same skill. They are, in many respects, opposing skills. A speaker who has mastered the platform tends to be too large for the living room, too emphatic, too theatrical, too obviously performing for an audience rather than speaking to a person. A speaker who is naturally suited to the living room, whose warmth and directness and apparent spontaneity work perfectly at close range, can seem, on the platform, slight and unconvincing, lacking the gravitas that the larger scale requires. The politicians and public figures who flourished in the television era were, almost without exception, people who could make this radical adjustment of scale instinctively, who understood that the camera was not an amplifier but a microscope, that it did not make you bigger but closer, and who calibrated their entire communicative presence accordingly. Kennedy was the first great master of this new scale, and studying how he managed it reveals a set of techniques that were, at the time, entirely without precedent in American political communication. His physical stillness under pressure was one of the most striking qualities of his television presence. Where other politicians, accustomed to platform speaking, would fill pauses with gesture and movement, Kennedy had the actor's discipline of doing less rather than more, trusting the camera's proximity to carry meaning that the platform speaker would have had to amplify through physical performance. His use of direct address to the camera, the sense of genuine eye contact with the viewer, of a man who was comfortable looking directly at you, was not natural or accidental. It was practiced and refined over years of television appearances, a skill he approached with the same methodical attention that his speechwriter Theodore Sorensen applied to the construction of his sentences. The combination of Kennedy's physical presence and Sorensen's prose produced something genuinely new in American political communication. A speaker who seems simultaneously to be speaking to millions of people and to each individual person alone, whose voice carried the intimacy of a private conversation and the authority of a national leader without any sense of contradiction between the two. His inaugural address, delivered on January 20th, 1961, is one of the most technically accomplished pieces of political rhetoric in the American tradition, and it is worth examining closely because it demonstrates, in a single relatively brief speech, almost every principle of effective persuasion that the preceding chapters of this book have identified. Sorensen and Kennedy worked on the text for weeks, and the finished product has a density of rhetorical devices per sentence that is extraordinary even by the standards of the great speeches we have discussed. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. This is the most famous line in the speech, and its fame is not accidental. It is the product of a specific rhetorical device called chiasmus, the reversal of a grammatical structure, which creates a kind of linguistic mirror effect that is almost physically satisfying to encounter and almost impossible not to remember. The same idea expressed differently, serve your country rather than expecting it to serve you, carries the same content, but none of the force, because the force comes from the formal symmetry of the reverse structure, which gives the statement the quality of an inevitable truth rather than an arguable position. By the time you have heard it once, you feel as if you have always known it, as if the sentence existed before Kennedy spoke it, and he merely discovered it rather than constructed it. That quality of apparent inevitability, which we identified in Lincoln's prose as one of its defining features, is the hallmark of rhetoric that has been worked on long enough and carefully enough that all the work has become invisible. The inaugural also demonstrates Kennedy's mastery of what might be called the rhetoric of generational identity, the use of shared historical position as the foundation for a collective sense of purpose and obligation. The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage. This sentence does several things simultaneously. It marks a historical transition with the simple, vivid image of the past torch. It defines the generation's identity through the specific historical experiences that have shaped it. It connects the present to the past through the phrase, ancient heritage, while simultaneously marking a break with that past through the image of the passing torch. And it addresses every person in the audience who belongs to this generation as a member of a collective defined by shared experience, making the individual feel both particular, one specific person shaped by these specific events, and universal, one member of a vast community bound by the same formation. This is the technique of collective identification that the great religious speakers used and that the great political speakers in every era have used. The creation, through language, of a community of shared identity and purpose that did not fully exist until the language called it into being. But Kennedy's mastery of television rhetoric also illustrates its limitations and its dangers, because the qualities the camera rewards are not always the qualities that governance requires. Television is extraordinarily good at transmitting warmth, directness, confidence, and the appearance of authenticity, qualities that are genuinely valuable in a leader, but that can also be convincingly simulated by people who possess the performance skills without the underlying character. Kennedy himself was a more complex and morally ambiguous figure than his television persona suggested, a man whose private conduct often contradicted the idealism of his public speech, whose actual policy decisions were frequently more cautious and equivocal than his rhetoric implied. The gap between the televised persona and the governing reality is not unique to Kennedy, but the television era made this gap structurally larger than it had ever been before, because the medium's capacity to construct a compelling human image operates largely independently of the content of that image. You can be an extraordinarily effective television communicator and a deeply dishonest person. You can project warmth while feeling none. You can project conviction while holding none. The camera cannot always tell the difference, and audiences, even sophisticated audiences who know perfectly well that political communication is a constructive performance, are frequently unable, in the moment of viewing, to maintain the critical distance that knowing this should provide. The intimacy is too convincing. The living room is too close. Ronald Reagan understood this more thoroughly than any American politician before or since, and his mastery of television communication operated at a level of sophistication that his critics consistently underestimated because they were looking for policy substance rather than rhetorical craft, and the policy substance was frequently not what it should have been. Reagan had spent 20 years in front of cameras as a professional actor before he entered politics, and he brought to political communication a set of skills that the acting profession develops with unusual rigor. The ability to make scripted dialogue feel spontaneous, the ability to convey genuine emotion through calculated physical technique, the ability to maintain the consistency of a constructed persona across radically different contexts and over extended periods of time, and above all, the ability to make the audience feel that they were seeing the real person behind the performance, which is, of course, the most demanding and the most effective performance of all. His particular genius was the deployment of story, the specific, human-scale anecdote used to make a large political argument feel personally real, with such consistent effectiveness that he became known, sometimes as a compliment and sometimes as a criticism, as the great communicator. The criticism embedded in that title, the implication that the communication was disconnected from the substance, was not entirely unfair, but it underestimated the degree to which the communication was itself a form of governance, the degree to which the stories Reagan told about America shaped what Americans believed about themselves, and what they were therefore willing to do, tolerate, and ignore. Barack Obama represents the fullest synthesis of the rhetorical traditions we have been tracing throughout this book. The classical structure of argument, the musical architecture of the Black church tradition, the intimate scale of television communication, and a quality of intellectual elegance that is entirely his own. He was, by any serious assessment, the most rhetorically gifted political communicator in American life since Kennedy, and he understood both the possibilities and the limitations of his gift with unusual clarity. His 2004 keynote address at the Democratic National Convention, delivered when he was a state senator from Illinois, almost entirely unknown outside his home state, is one of the most remarkable political speeches of the modern era, not primarily for its policy content, but for its structural architecture, which accomplished in a single speech what most political careers take decades to attempt. The construction of a public persona so compelling, so specifically rooted in personal history, and yet so universally resonant, that it seemed to belong to the entire country rather than to a single candidate. There is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America. There is not a Black America and a white America, and a Latino America, and an Asian America. There is the United States of America. This is the technique of the negative definition, the assertion of identity through the rejection of division, deployed with the rhythmic precision of the Black church tradition and the thematic ambition of the founding documents, landing on audience that had been waiting, without fully knowing it, for exactly this formulation of exactly this idea. The speech made Obama a national figure overnight, not because of what it argued, but because of what it performed, a vision of American unity, so complete and so beautifully expressed that people wanted desperately to believe it was real and transfer their desire to believe it onto the man who had made them feel it. His Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech in 2009 and his eulogy for the Reverend Clementa Pinckney in 2015, delivered in Charleston, South Carolina, 9 days after a white supremacist murdered Pinckney and 8 other parishioners in their church, represent Obama's rhetorical achievement at its deepest. The Charleston eulogy is, in the tradition of the African American funeral sermon, simultaneously an act of mourning and an act of proclamation, a meditation on death that becomes, through the accumulated pressure of its argument and its rhythm, a statement about life and what it demands. When Obama, near the end of the eulogy, began to sing, slowly, quietly, almost tentatively at first, and then with gathering conviction, the first notes of Amazing Grace, the moment was so unexpected and so completely right that it produced in the audience, and in the millions of people who watched it subsequently, a response that transcends ordinary rhetorical analysis. It was not a technique, or rather, it was the highest technique, the technique of absolute authenticity, the technique of a speaker who has merged so completely with their material that the performance and the feeling have become indistinguishable, and what the audience receives is not the product of rhetorical craft, but the unmediated transmission of something true. Whether it was spontaneous or calculated, Obama later indicated it was not planned. Matters less than what it demonstrates about the relationship between preparation and inspiration in great oratory. That the spontaneous gesture that lands with perfect force is almost always available only to the person whose preparation has been thorough enough to have exhausted the planned options, leaving only what is real. The digital revolution and the rise of social media represent the most recent, and in many ways the most disorienting transformation in the history of human communication, and its implications for rhetoric are still unfolding in ways that we cannot yet fully assess. But several things are already clear. The first is that the digital environment has radically compressed the attention available for any single piece of communication, creating a premium on the kind of immediate, visceral, emotionally triggering language that produces a strong reaction in the shortest possible time and at the cost of almost everything else: nuance, complexity, the sustained argument that builds its case over time, the careful establishment of context that great rhetoric has always required. The tweet, the post, the clip, the meme, these are the dominant forms of public language in the digital era, and they reward qualities of mind and expression that are almost perfectly opposed to those we have been tracing in the great speakers of history. They reward the surprising formulation over the accurate one, the outrageous claim over the carefully qualified one, the emotional trigger over the sustained argument, the identity performance over the genuine communication. This is not a small stylistic adjustment. It is a fundamental change in the ecology of public language, and its consequences for the quality of public life are not yet fully visible, but are already deeply concerning. The second thing the digital era has demonstrated is that the intimate scale of television communication, which Kennedy and Reagan and Obama mastered with such extraordinary effect, has been further compressed into something even more intimate and even more demanding: the parasocial relationship of the social media feed, in which public figures speak to audiences not from a television set in the living room, but from a phone screen held inches from the face in 100 different daily contexts, creating a simulation of personal friendship so convincing that millions of people feel they genuinely know, genuinely like, and genuinely trust figures they have never met and who are, in most cases, constructing their digital personas with as much care as any political speechwriter ever brought to a State of the Union address. This simulation of intimacy is the most powerful persuasive environment ever created, and it is operating, for the most part, without the institutional constraints, the editorial oversight, the fact-checking, the professional norms that have historically provided at least partial protection against the worst abuses of rhetorical power. The demagogue who in 1934 needed the Nuremberg Stadium to create the conditions for mass emotional manipulation can in 2024 create those conditions in 1 million individual living rooms simultaneously, without the architectural grandeur, without the uniformed crowds, without any of the visible markers of authoritarian theater that might trigger the audience's defenses. The manipulation is invisible because it looks like friendship. The propaganda, is unrecognized because it feels like authentic self-expression. The crowd psychology of the rally has been reproduced in the private space of the individual mind, and the individual sitting alone with their phone has no way of knowing that the emotion they are feeling, the outrage, the contempt, the tribal solidarity, the certainty, is not their own spontaneous response to reality, but the product of an engineered communicative environment designed to produce exactly that response in exactly that person at exactly that moment. And yet the digital era has also produced something that the pessimistic account of social media tends to overlook: a democratization of the rhetorical public sphere that is genuinely unprecedented in human history. The great speeches we have discussed in this book were delivered by people who had access to platforms, legal, religious, political, military, that were not available to most human beings. Cicero could speak in the Roman Senate because he was a member of the Roman Senate. Churchill could broadcast to the nation because he was prime minister. King could address 250,000 people at the Lincoln Memorial because a massive and complex organizational infrastructure had built the platform beneath him. For the billions of people throughout human history who had things worth saying, but no platform from which to say them, the great tradition of public oratory was not a tool available for their use. It was a tool used on them. The digital era has changed this in ways that are still working themselves out, but that have already produced extraordinary examples of what happens when rhetorical power is placed in the hands of people who were previously excluded from public speech. The young woman who stood up in front of the United Nations and made the leaders of the world feel the specific, personal weight of their failure to act on climate change. The teenager who filmed a police killing on a phone camera and, in circulating that footage, launched a global movement. The disability rights activist, the indigenous land defender, the undocumented student, all of them finding, in the digital public sphere, a platform that no previous era would have offered them, and using that platform with a directness and an emotional authenticity that the professional political communicators, with all their consultants and their talking points and their carefully managed messaging, frequently cannot match. The tools are available to everyone now. What we do with them, what tradition of speaking we choose to work in, what purposes we choose to serve, whether we build with language or burn with it, remains, as it has always remained, a choice that belongs to the individual human being who opens their mouth or picks up their phone and decides what to say. The history of rhetoric in the age of television and digital media is, ultimately, a story about the acceleration of something that has always been true. That communication technology shapes the rhetorical styles it makes possible. That every new medium creates new winners and new losers in the competition for public attention, and that the fundamental principles of effective communication, the establishment of trust, the calibration of emotion to reality, the specific image over the vague, generality, the truth told with sufficient craft to be felt as well as understood, remain operative regardless of the medium through which they are expressed. Aristotle did not have a television. He did not have a Twitter account. But if you read his rhetoric carefully and then read the research literature on digital communication and social media persuasion, the continuities are more striking than the differences. People still respond to ethos, to their perception of the speaker's trustworthiness and goodwill, before they respond to argument. They still respond to specific images more powerfully than to abstract claims. They still respond to narrative more readily than to data. They still make decisions with emotion and use reason to justify what they have already decided. The medium changes. The mind does not change nearly as fast. And the person who understands the mind, who has studied, with sufficient care and sufficient humility, the long history of human beings try to reach each other through language, has an advantage in every medium, in every era, that the technically sophisticated but humanly inattentive communicator can never fully overcome. The screen is new. The soul it is trying to reach is ancient. The bridge between them is built, as it has always been built, from the oldest material in the world. The right word, in the right place, at the right time, in the service of something true enough to deserve the effort. We have traveled a long way together. We began in Athens, where a young man put stones in his mouth and shouted at the sea, and we have arrived in the age of the smartphone, where a teenager with a camera can launch a global movement before breakfast. We have sat with Cicero in the Roman Senate, and with Lincoln in the flickering light of a battlefield dedication. We have felt the architecture of Churchill's sentences and the music of King's voice and the cold, precise machinery of the demagogues' emotional manipulation. We have watched rhetoric build republics and burn them, liberate the oppressed, and conscript them into their own oppression, elevate the human spirit to its most luminous possibilities, and drag it toward its darkest corners. And now, having made this journey, having seen so much of what language in its most deliberate and powerful form has done in the world, it seems right to stop and ask the question that all of this history is, in the end, pointing toward. What does it mean? What do we carry away from this long examination of the people who bent history with words? What do the greatest speakers in human history, taken together as a tradition and a conversation across time, teach us, not just about rhetoric, but about ourselves? The first and perhaps most important thing they teach us is something that our age has a particular difficulty accepting. That words are not merely descriptive. They are not labels attached to pre-existing realities, neutral instruments for pointing at things that exist independently of the language used to name them. Words are, at their most powerful, generative. They bring things into being. They create the realities they describe, not by magic, but by the deeply human mechanism of shared meaning. The fact that when enough people accept a particular description of the world, that acceptance becomes a social fact with real consequences. Consequences as concrete and as physically present as any material force. When Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, that statement was not a description of the world as it then existed. It was a description of a world that did not yet exist, spoken with such force and given such authority that it gradually, painfully, incompletely, but unmistakably began to pull the actual world in its direction. When Churchill said, "We shall never surrender," the surrender he was refusing had not yet happened. He was not describing a fact. He was creating one, installing a commitment in the public consciousness with such precision and such permanence that walking away from it became psychologically impossible. When King described his dream, the dream was not reality. It was an aspiration, a promissory note, a vision of possibility articulated with sufficient beauty and sufficient force that it changed what people believed was possible and changed people's behavior accordingly, and thereby changed the world. The word did not follow the reality. The reality followed the word. This is what the greatest speakers understood and what their speeches demonstrate again and again across the centuries. Language is not a mirror held up to the world. It is a hand reaching into the world and rearranging it. The second thing the tradition teaches us is about the relationship between preparation and authenticity, a relationship that our culture tends to misunderstand in ways that diminish both. We live in an age that values authenticity above almost everything else in communication, an age suspicious of polish and craft and the visible marks of preparation, an age that tends to trust the stumbling, unscripted, apparently spontaneous over the polished, rehearsed, and carefully constructed. There is something genuine and valuable in this preference, a legitimate recognition that performed authenticity is a form of manipulation, that a voice calibrated entirely for effect has lost something essential to genuine communication. But the preference for spontaneity over craft, taken too far, produces a contempt for the discipline that makes great communication possible. And this contempt is both intellectually confused and practically destructive. Demosthenes was not less authentic for having put stones in his mouth. Churchill's broadcasts were not less genuine for having been revised 17 times before delivery. King's "I Have a Dream" was not less sincere for having been built from years of absorbed tradition, refined through hundreds of performances, and arrived at its final form through the combination of enormous preparation and inspired improvisation. In every case, the preparation was in the service of the authentic. It was the mechanism by which the genuine conviction found its most complete and most communicable form. The craft did not replace the feeling. It released it, gave it shape, made it transferable. A violinist who has practiced 10,000 hours is not less authentic than one who has practiced 10. They are more capable of expressing what they actually feel because the technique is no longer an obstacle between the feeling and its expression. The greatest speakers were the people for whom language itself had become this kind of instrument, so thoroughly internalized, so completely available, that it could carry whatever they needed it to carry without strain, without visible effort, with the appearance of inevitability that is the highest achievement of any craft. The third lesson is about the relationship between rhetoric and truth, and it is the most important lesson of all, the one that everything else in this book has been building toward. The history of great speaking is not a neutral catalog of techniques. It is a moral history, a record of what language can do when it is aligned with genuine human need and genuine human truth, and what it does when that alignment fails or is deliberately broken. We have seen both. We have seen Cicero exposing a real conspiracy in language so precise that the conspiracy could not survive the exposure. We have seen Lincoln finding words for the actual cost and the actual meaning of the actual war he was actually fighting, words so complete that they have served every subsequent generation trying to understand the same fundamental conflict between freedom and oppression. We have seen King giving language to the actual experience of actual people and actual pain, making that experience so vividly present that people who had never lived it could feel its weight and be changed by feeling it. And we have seen the alternative, the speaker who constructs a false reality with the same tools, who uses the techniques of emotional amplification to make fabricated threats feel as urgent as real ones, who deploys the rhetoric of community and identity not to build genuine solidarity, but to manufacture hatred, who uses the power of narrative not to illuminate the world, but to distort it. The techniques are identical. The outcomes are as different as civilization and its destruction. And the difference, as this book has argued from its first pages, lies not in the craft, but in the truth, in the accuracy of the picture the speaker is painting, in the honesty of the emotional response they are cultivating, in the integrity of the alignment between what they say and what they know and what they believe. This distinction between rhetoric in the service of truth and rhetoric in the service of its opposite is not always easy to make, and anyone who tells you it is has not been paying close enough attention to the history. The greatest speakers were not always right about everything. Lincoln's views on race evolved slowly and incompletely, and some of his early positions are not easy to defend. Churchill's magnificent wartime rhetoric coexisted with colonial attitudes that caused immense suffering. King's extraordinary moral vision was expressed by a man whose private life contained genuine contradictions. The tradition of great speaking is a human tradition, produced by human beings in all their complexity and limitation, and it does not offer us a gallery of saints. What it offers us is something more useful, a set of principles tested across centuries and cultures and the full range of human experience about what it means to use language well and what it means to use it badly. It offers us a standard, not a perfect standard, not a standard that any speaker has ever fully met, but a real one against which we can measure what we hear and what we say. Does this speech tell the truth about the situation? Does the emotion it cultivates correspond to the reality it describes? Does the simplification it offers clarify the truth or conceal it? Does the community it creates include people or exclude them? elevate them or diminish them, make them more free or less? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are the right questions, and the history of great oratory teaches us, above all else, how to ask them. The fourth lesson is perhaps the most personally challenging, because it is addressed not to the audience of great speeches, but to the potential speakers, to the question of what any individual person, living in the present moment, can take from this extraordinary tradition and use. The temptation, when confronted with the giants of rhetorical history, is to feel diminished, to conclude that whatever you have to say could never matter in the way that Cicero's words mattered, or Churchill's, or King's, and that the gap between your ordinary voice and their extraordinary ones is simply too large to cross. This is a temptation that should be resisted firmly, because it is based on a misunderstanding of how great speaking actually works and how great speakers actually develop. None of them began great. Every single figure in this book started from a position of inadequacy, inadequate preparation, inadequate confidence, inadequate recognition, and built toward greatness through a combination of sustained effort, relentless attention to the craft, and the willingness to speak at the moments when speaking was hardest and most necessary. Demosthenes was laughed off the platform. Churchill was dismissed as a reckless crank. King was a 26-year-old minister with no national profile when he stood up in a Montgomery church and had 20 minutes to say something that would determine whether a movement lived or died. What they had at the beginning was not greatness. It was willingness, the willingness to work at the craft, to study the tradition, to observe human beings with sufficient care to understand what they needed to hear, and then to stand up and say it, imperfectly at first, and with increasing mastery over time. The practical principles that emerge from the tradition are surprisingly consistent across all the examples we have examined, and they are worth stating plainly as we approach the end of this journey. The first principle is to know your audience with the same depth and specificity that you know your subject. Every great speaker we have examined, from Paul adjusting his message for Jewish and Greek audiences, to Lincoln calibrating the Gettysburg Address for a nation in mourning, to King addressing the dual audience of black pain and white conscience, demonstrated an almost uncanny attentiveness to the specific human beings they were trying to reach. They did not speak at audiences. They spoke to them from inside a detailed and empathetic understanding of who those audiences were, what they feared, what they hoped for, what they already believed, and what they needed to feel in order to move from where they were to where the speaker needed them to go. This attentiveness is not a talent. It is a discipline, the discipline of sustained, genuine, humble curiosity about other human beings, the willingness to listen before you speak, and to let what you hear actually change what you say. The second principle is to find the specific image, the precise story, the particular detail that carries the weight of the general truth you are trying to convey. Vague language produces vague understanding and vague feeling. The specific moment, the specific beach, the specific dream, the specific child, produces understanding and feeling that lodge in the memory and resist the passage of time. Every great speaker in this tradition was, at their core, a great observer of specific reality, a person who could look at the world with sufficient attention to find the particular image that captured the universal truth and sufficient craft to present that image in terms that made the universality felt. This is not a mystical talent. It is a practice, the practice of noticing, of looking closely enough at the particular to see the general inside it, and then finding the words that make the particular vivid enough that the general becomes inescapable. The third principle is to understand that rhythm and sound are not decorative elements of language, but load-bearing ones. That the music of a sentence determines, as much as its meaning, how deeply it penetrates and how long it stays. The anaphora, the chiasmus, the carefully constructed parallel structure, the sentence that ends on a strong syllable rather than a weak one. These are not ornaments. They are mechanisms, as functional as the arguments they carry, by which language reaches the parts of the human mind that purely cognitive analysis cannot access. Every great speaker studied in this book understood, at some level of intuition or explicit knowledge, that they were composing music as well as argument, that the sound of what they were saying was part of what made it true. Developing this sensitivity to the sound of language, reading aloud, listening closely, attending to the rhythm and weight of words rather than merely their definitions, is one of the most important things any aspiring speaker can do, and it is one of the most consistently neglected. The fourth principle is the most fundamental and the most demanding, and it is the one from which all the others derive their purpose. Speak the truth. Not the comfortable truth, not the truth that your audience most wants to hear, not the truth that makes everyone feel good and no one feel challenged, but the actual truth, the most accurate, most complete, most honestly assessed picture of the situation that your understanding can produce. This principle is demanding because genuine truth-telling requires a degree of courage that is not always comfortable to summon. It requires the willingness to say things that might disappoint or anger or challenge the people you most want to please. It requires the intellectual honesty to acknowledge what you don't know and what you can't claim, even when the speech would be more impressive without those acknowledgments. And it requires the moral seriousness to accept that the power of rhetoric, the capacity of language to move people, to change minds, to produce action, is a power that carries real obligations, that cannot be exercised irresponsibly without real consequences, and that is never more dangerous than when it is deployed in the service of something the speaker knows, at some level, is not quite true. The great speakers we have examined in this book were, at their best, people who accepted these obligations fully. Cicero knew the risks of exposing Catiline and accepted them. Lincoln knew that his second inaugural would disappoint the partisans who wanted celebration and gave them reflection instead. King knew that his letter from Birmingham jail, perhaps the greatest piece of argumentative prose in the American tradition, written in the margins of newspapers and on scraps of paper smuggled in and out of jail cell, would irritate the moderate white clergyman he was addressing and said what he needed to say anyway, because the truth of the situation required it. These moments, the moments when a speaker chose the accurate and difficult thing over the comfortable and easy one, are the moments when rhetoric becomes something more than craft. They are the moments when craft and courage and conviction converge, when the speaker becomes fully present to the demands of their moment and meets those demands with everything they have, and when the words produced in that convergence acquire the quality that distinguishes the merely impressive from the genuinely great, the quality of truth felt at the level of the body, understood at the level of the mind, and lodged at the level of the soul. There is one final thing that the tradition teaches us, and it is perhaps the strangest and most beautiful lesson of all. It is about time. The speeches in this book were not written for us. Cicero was not thinking about 21st century readers when he rose in the Roman Senate to expose Catiline's conspiracy. Lincoln was not thinking about the civil rights movement of a century later when he spoke at Gettysburg. King was not thinking about the movements that would invoke his words in countries he had never visited, by people fighting injustices he had never specifically addressed. They were thinking about their specific moment, their specific audience, their specific urgency, their specific truth. And yet here we are, centuries and decades removed from those moments, and the words still work. They still move us. They still teach us. They still, in the best cases, help us find the language for things we feel but cannot quite say. Help us locate, in the long record of human beings trying to reach each other through language, the precise formulation that names what we are living through and points toward what we might yet become. This persistence, this refusal of the greatest language to stay in its original context, this tendency of the best words to keep finding new situations in which they are exactly right, is not incidental to the tradition. It is its most important feature. It tells us that the craft of speaking well is not merely a practical skill with immediate applications. It is a contribution to a conversation that began before any of us were born and will continue after all of us are gone. A conversation about what it means to be human, what we owe each other, what we are capable of, and what we might become if we find, at the crucial moment, the right words to say it. The greatest speakers in history understood this. They understood that the words they were constructing were not merely tools for a specific occasion, but gifts to the future, offerings to people they would never meet, in situations they could not foresee, to be used in ways they could not predict. This is why they worked so hard at the craft. This is why Demosthenes went to the seashore and Lincoln revised by candlelight, and Churchill dictated at 3 in the morning in his dressing gown. Not because they were perfectionists, though some of them were. Not because they were vain about their prose, though some of them were that too. But because they understood, at some level, that language used with sufficient precision and sufficient honesty and sufficient care becomes something that outlasts the occasion that produced it, something that joins the long stream of human expression that connects us to our past and extends toward our future, something that future generations will reach for when they need words for their own crucial moments and find, waiting for them across the centuries, exactly the formulation they required. The best speeches are not products of their time. They are contributions to all time. They are the human mind at its most deliberate and its most genuine, trying to tell the truth about the world in the hope that someone, somewhere, sometime, will hear it and be changed by what they hear. We began with the observation that words are the most dangerous weapon ever forged. We end with the recognition that they are also the most constructive tool ever devised, more durable than bronze, more flexible than steel, more capable than any physical technology of producing the only transformation that ultimately matters, the transformation of one human mind by another, the crossing of the gap between one consciousness and another across the bridge of shared language, the ancient and ongoing miracle of genuine communication. The speakers who mastered this craft, who dedicated themselves to understanding how it worked, and then used that understanding in the service of something real and important and true, they did not merely make speeches. They made history, not with armies or wealth or the machinery of power, but with the astonishing, fragile, inexhaustible, and deeply human gift of the right word at the right moment in the right voice. That gift is available to anyone willing to do the work of understanding it. The tradition is open. The craft is learnable. The conversation continues. And somewhere right now, someone is preparing to stand up and say something that will matter, that will reach into the present moment and rearrange it, that will give language to what a room full of people feel but cannot say, that will send words forward into a future that needs them. That person might be a leader or a student, a preacher or a scientist, a politician or a poet, a parent speaking to their child, or a citizen speaking to their community. What they will share with every great speaker in this long and remarkable tradition is the thing that cannot be taught but can be cultivated, the thing that all the technique in the world ultimately serves, the conviction that what they are about to say is true, that it matters, and that the moment for saying it is now.